Hi guys! Tonight we begin with shadows that stretch across marble streets and candlelit chambers, where the smell of incense never quite covers the scent of sweat, wine, and whispered confessions. You lie back and picture Rome in its medieval nights, bells tolling softly in the distance. But behind guarded doors the atmosphere is anything but holy. Imagine walking into a velvet-draped hall, where the men who claim to guard heaven's keys recline like emperors, and women glide in with the sly confidence of courtesans, who know their presence is as essential as prayer. You probably won't survive this journey through memory if you expect sanctity alone, because beneath the solemn hymns ran a current of flesh and scandal strong enough to drown a saint. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, I'd love it if you shared your location and the local time you're listening in the comments. Now, dim the lights, you trudge with me into the labyrinth of papal history, where power is scented with roses and rotting fruit at the same time. The shocking truth is that medieval popes were not just shepherds of souls, they were also rulers with armies, treasuries, and appetites. Their lives unfolded in a Rome that was both sacred and profane. On one hand, you have processions where relics gleamed under golden canopies, and on the other, you have secret banquets where candles flickered over tables strewn with roasted game, sweetmeats, and more intoxicating pleasures. A mainstream historical fact is that by the High Middle Ages, the papacy had cemented itself not just as a religious office but as a political powerhouse. Popes negotiated treaties, claimed dominion over kings, and even launched crusades. The Lateran Palace, before the Vatican as you picture it today, was a fortress of both diplomacy and decadence. It's not surprising that with such immense authority, the men who sat on the papal throne felt little restraint in their personal lives. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some chroniclers describe papal banquets where delicacies were arranged in the shapes of mythological creatures, and where jugglers, musicians, and jesters performed not just for entertainment, but as sly commentators. Imagine sipping watered wine and hearing a jester crack jokes about the Pope's mistress delivered with a wink, a reminder that everyone knew, but no one dared to write it in the official record. These feasts were the stuff of whispered legend, tales that travelled as far as Paris or London, gaining scandalous flourishes along the way. Scholars still debate whether the most infamous rumors orgies staged in papal chambers, priests cavorting with courtesans in sacred cloisters, were rooted in fact or in propaganda spread by enemies. Medieval politics thrived on smear campaigns, and what better weapon than accusing God's representative of wallowing in sin? Even so, enough evidence survives to suggest that at least some of these tales carried kernels of truth. As you sink deeper into this night, you picture Rome itself, crooked alleys echoing with the laughter of prostitutes who clustered around the papal palaces, because business boomed where power gathered. Street vendors sold trinkets and roasted chestnuts, while, inside stone walls, the clink of goblets and rustle of silks told a different story. The contradiction is dizzying. Holiness proclaimed on altars by day, while velvet dark secrets unfolded by night. You feel the tension like a violin string stretched tight between the sacred image projected outward and the private indulgence cultivated within. It's almost comical when you think about it. Pilgrims trudged barefoot to kiss relics, while, not far away, papal courtiers gossiped about who was favored in bed. Power was never just about prayers or swords. It was also about desire, about the intimacy of influence that slipped through sheets and whispered promises. Close your eyes for a moment. The air is heavy with incense, but underneath there's that other smell: perfume. Sweat, a trace of wax melting in candelabra. You hear footsteps echoing in the marble corridor, then muffled laughter, the kind that tells you something forbidden has just occurred. You can't quite prove it, but you feel it in your bones. That is the heart of tonight's journey, a story caught between evidence and rumor, between ritual and revelry. Think of this as a velvet night of scandal, unfolding slowly as you drift towards sleep. You're not asked to judge, only to observe, to let your mind wander through centuries where even the holiest thrones could not escape human desire. And as you drift further, remember this is only the beginning. The papacy has many masks, and tonight you've only brushed the first layer of velvet away. You continue down the echoing corridors of memory, and now you step into a chamber, less gilded and more martial. The truth about medieval popes is that they were not simply priests cloaked in white robes, they were feudal lords, often more concerned with land, soldiers, and castles than with scripture. You picture yourself moving through a papal hall not filled with monks praying, but with armored knights clanking in with muddy boots, pledging allegiance to the man who claimed authority over heaven and earth. The Pope in this age often looked and acted more like a warlord than a shepherd, commanding armies to defend the papal states and scheming with kings to expand his influence. A mainstream historical fact is that the papacy functioned as a sovereign power, controlling vast swaths of central Italy known as the Papal States. These territories required constant defense against rebellious nobles, ambitious emperors, and foreign invaders. To keep control, popes levied taxes, built fortresses, and kept retinues of mercenaries. The Holy Father's palace was not just a place of prayer, it was a court buzzing with diplomacy, negotiations, and espionage. You imagine the sounds not of choirs but of parchment rustling, guards shouting, and scribes hurriedly recording agreements that could shift the fate of Europe. Here's a quirky tidbit that slips into the scene. Certain popes were so involved in secular politics that they issued papal bulls about irrigation ditches, wine regulations, or even the rights of butchers in Roman markets. Imagine the supposed vicar of Christ on earth giving his seal to rules about how much salt should be added to sausages. The contradiction is almost funny, yet it shows how deeply entangled spiritual power was with everyday secular concerns. You walk across the marble floor and picture banners hung in the papal hall, not just crosses, but heraldic shields from allied families. The papacy was a chessboard, and the Pope himself was the most dangerous piece in the game. He could excommunicate emperors, crown kings, and launch wars, all while maintaining the facade of a celibate pastor. You feel the dissonance. On one side, the sermons thundered about humility and chastity. On the other, the Pope lived like a prince, surrounded by treasures, mistresses, and political cronies. Historians continue to disagree about how sincere these men were in their faith. Some argue they were utterly cynical, using religion as a mask to cover naked ambition. Others suggest they genuinely believed themselves chosen by God, and that their worldly indulgences were simply part of ruling effectively. After all, medieval kings themselves saw no contradiction between praying devoutly in the morning and hosting a raucous feast at night. Why should the Pope be any different? As you drift in the candlelit gloom, the line between priest and prince blurs before your eyes. You see the papal throne as both altar and dais, where prayers mingled with decrees, and where courtiers whispered about alliances sealed not only with oaths, but with bedsheets. Behind closed doors, mistresses waited in silk-draped rooms. Their presence was rarely acknowledged officially, but their influence was undeniable. You sense that the Pope's role as a feudal prince made such arrangements almost inevitable. Power and pleasure were not separate spheres, they were intertwined, each feeding the other. Picture the streets outside. Merchants sell silks, spices, and fine wines, knowing the papal court will pay well for luxuries. Prostitutes cluster in alleys, ready to serve the needs of cardinals, bishops, and guards alike. Rome pulses like a heart divided between heaven and earth. The Pope, at the center of it, lives in contradiction. Priest at the altar, monarch in his palace, patron of art, commander of troops, and scandalous lover behind veils. As you breathe into this thought, you realize how the papacy's princely role paved the way for everything that followed. The mistresses in the Lateran, the children born in secrecy, the feasts of flesh. None of that would make sense if the Pope were merely a humble cleric. But as a feudal lord, wielding both sword and scepter, his private life naturally mirrored the indulgence of any ruling dynasty. And so, with the candles flickering low, you begin to see the stage set for centuries of both holiness and scandal, woven tightly together. You walk a little deeper into the shadowy halls of history, and the air grows heavier, as though every candle struggles to burn against the thick scent of hypocrisy. Tonight you see celibacy itself, the solemn vow that priests and popes were expected to keep treated less like a sacred chain and more like a loose sash, untied whenever convenient. You imagine yourself watching a procession of clerics, their white robes pristine in public, but you know that behind locked doors those garments came off easily. A mainstream historical fact is that clerical celibacy became officially mandated in the Western Church by the 12th century. Councils and decrees insisted that priests and popes remain unmarried, abstaining from all sexual relations to devote themselves wholly to God. Yet the reality on the ground was anything but pure. The rule was widely ignored. Priests openly kept concubines, bishops lived with common-law wives, and even popes shrugged off the restriction as if it were a minor inconvenience. Chroniclers complain about priests fathering children, while parishioners grumbled about the hypocrisy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some parishes actually charged priests a fee for keeping a mistress, as though it were a formal tax. Imagine sliding a coin across the table to your bishop for the concubine license, much like paying for a fishing permit. It's absurd, and yet true. It became easier to monetize sin than to prevent it. And if lower clergy could manage such arrangements, you can only imagine the indulgences of popes who sat at the top of the hierarchy, wrapped in power and untouchable by ordinary laws. You move through the corridors of papal chambers and picture discreet women slipping in after sunset, perhaps through side doors guarded by loyal servants. No chronicler records the details, but the silences speak loudly. The men of God justified themselves in many ways. Some said the Old Testament fathers had wives. Others whispered that loneliness was too heavy a cross. Still others insisted their private lives did not diminish their authority. You can almost hear those excuses whispered in the dark. Scholars remain divided over how openly the Vatican itself tolerated these lapses. Some argue that Rome turned a blind eye, preferring not to expose its own scandals. Others suggest that celibacy was enforced with occasional severity, public examples made of a few unlucky clerics, while the powerful quietly carried on unbothered. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, where double standards reigned, and money or influence determined whether a pope's mistress was considered a scandal or simply an open secret. You pause in a dimly lit room and picture the tension it created. On one side, the clergy preached sermons about purity, virginity, and self-denial. On the other, their actions betrayed indulgence, desire, and the familiar pull of the flesh. It's not hard to imagine the murmurs of ordinary people. Why should we obey rules that even the Holy Father ignores? That disconnect planted seeds of cynicism that would eventually bloom into outright rebellion centuries later. Imagine the sensory world of those nights. The Lateran palace filled with the smell of beeswax candles, damp stone, and perfume clinging to a mistress's hair. The sound of footsteps soft on marble, of laughter muffled behind drapes, of prayers interrupted by sighs. You feel yourself caught in the contradiction, half in a chapel where voices chant psalms, half in a chamber where sheets rustle with forbidden intimacy. It almost makes you smile at the irony. Rules written on parchment with solemn ink, rules meant to keep the church pure, and yet the same ink barely dry before the very men who signed them found ways to bend or break them. And still, the institution carried on, draped in authority, proclaiming holiness with one hand while pouring wine with the other. As you drift deeper into this quiet scandal, you realize that the vow of celibacy was not so much ignored out of ignorance, but consciously sidestepped. The medieval papacy was built on power, and power rarely allows itself to be restrained by rules. That reality set the tone for centuries of indulgence, paving the way for even greater scandals to come. You drift now into the corridors of the Lateran itself, that ancient palace before the Vatican became the main stage. By day, it hosted councils and ceremonies, with incense thick in the air and solemn choirs echoing off marble walls. But at night, if you pressed your ear against the heavy doors, you would catch a very different melody: soft laughter, the rustle of silks, the clinking of goblets, and the muffled footsteps of women moving quietly through papal chambers. Mistresses in the Lateran were not rare whispers but living presences, woven into the daily fabric of papal life. A mainstream historical fact is that Pope Sergius III in the 10th century was accused of openly keeping a mistress, Marozia, a powerful noblewoman who herself came from a family that virtually controlled Rome for decades. Chroniclers claim she bore him a son who would later become Pope John XI. The so-called pornocracy of the 10th century, an era where women of Roman aristocracy ruled papal affairs through intimate ties, shows how mistresses weren't just secret lovers. They could be political actors in their own right, shaping the fate of Christendom from behind closed doors. Here's a quirky tidbit that lingers like perfume in the air. Some of these women were referred to half-jokingly as papessa, a playful title that captured both their influence and their scandal. Imagine gossiping merchants on a Roman street, smirking as they whispered about the Lady Pope, who held more sway over papal decrees than half the cardinals combined. It sounds like satire, but it reflected a lived truth. Women who shared the Pope's bed often had his ear, his trust, and sometimes his political authority. Historians still argue about how much power these mistresses truly wielded. Were they clever manipulators steering papal decisions, or were they simply indulged companions who benefited from wealth and status? The sources are tangled in rumor and partisan propaganda, making it hard to know. But what remains certain is that their presence could not be denied. Mistresses in the Lateran were visible enough that their influence was both feared and mocked, etched into the chronicles of Rome like graffiti on stone. You imagine yourself wandering through one of those papal feasting halls. Tapestries shimmer with depictions of saints, but between the folds of cloth, women recline on cushions, laughing softly as cardinals exchange glances. Candles drip wax onto the long tables where platters of roast meat cool slowly. Somewhere down the corridor, pilgrims kneel in prayer, unaware that not far away, the pontiff himself shares wine with his companion of the night. The contrast is surreal. One part sacred, one part decadent, both existing side by side in the very heart of Christendom. The Lateran became a palace of contradictions. Its chapels rang with hymns, but its private apartments carried whispers of lovers and children. Some popes even provided residences and titles for their mistresses, showering them with gifts of land and jewels. It is not hard to picture one such woman strolling the palace gardens, her gown embroidered with gold thread, pausing to pluck a rose while guards salute her as though she were nobility. The line between sacred and profane blurs until you cannot tell one from the other, and yet, perhaps you feel a strange empathy. These women lived in a dangerous world, where their position was secured only by the shifting favor of the most powerful man alive. Every smile, every whisper, every glance had to be carefully weighed, for behind the velvet was steel. The same pope who adored a mistress could banish her in an instant, or worse, replace her with another. You sense the fragility of it all, desire and danger braided together like strands of a candle wick, burning brightly but never for long. As you lie back and let the images pass, the Lateran comes alive not as a monument of faith but as a theatre of human longing. You hear the mingled sounds of chants from the chapel and laughter from behind locked doors. You smell incense layered over perfume, roast meat masking the musk of bodies. You feel the dissonance of it all, holy words spoken by day and intimate promises whispered by night. And in that uneasy blend, you see the truth. The papal palace was never just a house of God. It was also a house of desire, and mistresses were part of its very heartbeat. You step into another echoing chamber, and this time the scene is not about private indulgence, but about how intimacy itself became a tool in the vast machinery of papal politics. You can almost hear the scrape of quills as clerks record names, titles, and property rights, while behind closed doors something softer but no less powerful is at work. In the medieval papacy, the bedroom was not only a place of pleasure, it was an extension of the throne room. Nepotism through the bedroom shaped dynasties, and you feel yourself caught in that tangle of passion and power. A mainstream historical fact is that the very word nepotism has papal roots. From the Latin nepos, meaning nephew, it reflected the common practice of popes elevating their illegitimate sons, by calling them nephews and bestowing them with high office. This sleight of hand allowed a pope to secure his family line without admitting openly to fatherhood. It was more than favoritism, it was dynasty building in priestly robes. Families like the Borgia, the Orsini, and the Medici rose to prominence through such strategies, cementing themselves into the web of papal power. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some mistresses were introduced at court under the guise of widowed cousins or distant relatives, their children later presented as papal nephews who just happened to be extraordinarily well provided for. You can picture the smirk of a courtier who knew exactly what was going on, bowing low while whispering jokes about how quickly divine providence seemed to bless the Pope's family. It was both scandalous and practical, the kind of double-speak everyone recognized but few dared to challenge. Scholars remain divided on how deliberate these strategies really were. Some argue that popes cynically exploited intimacy to lock down alliances, using lovers and children as pawns in the grand game of European politics. Others suggest that personal relationships naturally spilled over into political networks, as affection intertwined with ambition. The evidence often lies buried in chronicles written by enemies, leaving you to wonder whether the popes were Machiavellian schemers or simply men swept along by family ties and desire. Picture a gathering in a Lateran salon, velvet cushions, golden cups of spiced wine, and behind them a noblewoman rumoured mistress of the Pope presenting her son to cardinals. The boy is handsome, dressed in miniature finery, and the whispers say he will soon be given a title, perhaps even the scarlet robes of a cardinal. You sense the unease in the room, but also the resignation. Everyone knows what is happening. Everyone plays along. The Pope smiles, the courtiers applaud politely, and another illegitimate child begins his climb toward power. You linger on the irony. The Church preached celibacy as a shield against worldly corruption, but in practice it used the very children born of broken vows to weave webs of loyalty. These nephews were placed in positions of wealth, granted bishoprics, or married into noble families, binding alliances that shaped the fate of entire regions. It was a family business masquerading as a spiritual mission. Step into the sensory details with me. The smell of wax and wine, the weight of embroidered robes, the flicker of torchlight on faces that hide secrets with practiced smiles. Outside, pilgrims shuffle through muddy streets, hoping for blessings. Inside, powerful families negotiate through whispered promises, their fortunes tied not to miracles, but to who shares a bed with the Pope. The practice bred resentment. Cynical voices muttered that salvation itself seemed for sale, traded for kisses and bloodlines. The ordinary faithful saw papal nephews elevated above them and wondered what justice could possibly mean in such a world. That discontent simmered for centuries, eventually bursting forth in fiery sermons and reformist cries. And as you settle into the rhythm of these images, you realize that intimacy in papal Rome was never merely personal. It was structural, political, dynastic. The Pope's bedroom was as powerful as his throne room, and the lovers who entered it became silent architects of Christendom's future. You leave the chamber knowing that nepotism was not a side effect of scandal, it was central to the papacy's very survival. You slip deeper into the papal apartments, and this time you notice that what once lived in the shadows is no longer entirely hidden. The figures you see are not simply whispered about, they are acknowledged. These are not furtive liaisons conducted with shame, but companions whose existence was known to cardinals, ambassadors, and the Roman street alike. The papal concubine was often as real a presence in the Lateran or Vatican as the Pope himself, her influence brushing across every decision, from feasts to foreign treaties. One historical reality stands out. During the 15th century, popes like Sixtus IV and Innocent VIII were notorious for keeping long-term mistresses whose identities were no secret. Innocent VIII fathered several children, arranging advantageous marriages for them with noble families, while his mistress was granted estates and lived in comfort. To contemporaries, this was less shocking than you might imagine. People grumbled, yes, but they also accepted it as part of how power operated. Celibacy was a rule often cited and seldom enforced, especially for those who sat on the throne of Peter. You may find it amusing that diplomatic visitors sometimes noted the Pope's mistress in their reports back to their rulers, listing her influence alongside military alliances and trade deals. Imagine a Venetian ambassador dipping his quill and writing, "The Pope's companion is well received at court. She speaks favorably of our merchants." Such casual references show how normalized the situation had become. These women were not ghosts slipping through back passages, they were public figures of sorts, navigating the corridors of power with confidence. Writers at the time had differing takes on this. Some praised these women as stabilizing forces who softened the tempers of irritable popes, while others lampooned them as corrupt temptresses pulling the strings of the church. Was the papal mistress a partner in governance, or simply a symbol of hypocrisy? The question still divides scholars, who wrestle with sources that are part record, part gossip, part satire. The truth, like perfume drifting in candlelight, is hard to grasp, but impossible to deny. Picture a banquet in the Vatican gardens, long tables covered with linen, pitchers of wine sweating in the summer heat, cardinals and noblemen fanning themselves under the orange trees. At the head sits the Pope, and next to him, not hidden at all, is his mistress, jewels flashing, hair braided with ribbons, laughing lightly at a joke. You sense the uneasy silence around the table. Everyone knows her role, but everyone also knows it is safer to smile and pretend that all is proper. Even the arts bore witness to this reality. Painters commissioned by the papal court sometimes slipped subtle likenesses of mistresses into frescoes, disguising them as saints or allegories. A viewer today might walk past a Renaissance chapel without realizing that the serene Virgin in the corner was based on the face of a pope's lover. These images whispered their secrets through brushstrokes, immortalizing women who official records often tried to erase. Let yourself imagine the sounds and smells of those moments, the laughter echoing against marble, the perfume of roses in the garden mingling with roasting meat, the clink of rings against goblets as alliances were toasted. These sensory details remind you that papal Rome was not a place of abstract debates alone. It was lived reality, full of texture, sound, and smell. The concubines were part of that lived reality, shaping it in subtle ways that official decrees could never quite capture. Critics of the papacy had a field day with this. Preachers thundered that Rome had become a new Babylon, dripping with decadence and lust. Satirists painted the Pope's court as a carnival of flesh, mocking the idea that men who could not control their own desires could possibly guide the souls of millions. These caricatures, spread through sermons, pamphlets, and gossip, helped create the image of a church in need of reform. But the lived truth was messier. Some of these relationships appear to have been affectionate and lasting, marked not by scandal but by companionship. In a world where marriages among nobles were often cold political contracts, a pope's mistress might experience more warmth than many legitimate wives elsewhere. Does that redeem the hypocrisy? Perhaps not. But it adds a layer of complexity to the story, reminding you that human longing seldom fits neatly into rules written on parchment. As you sink into this thought, you picture the papal mistress not as a shadowy figure, but as a woman walking boldly down the corridors, servants bowing, guards stepping aside, cardinals whispering as she passes. She is both powerful and precarious, basking in luxury yet vulnerable to shifts in favor. One moment she influences papal appointments, the next she may be replaced, her name erased, her rooms given to another. Desire and danger remain constant companions in these gilded halls. In the end, what you see here is not simply sin, but a system where relationships were entangled with politics, diplomacy, and power. The papal mistress was a visible thread in the fabric of Rome, woven into both scandal and governance. And as you drift further into this story, you realize that her presence is not just a footnote, it is central to the rhythm of papal life, an echo of desire that resounded beneath the solemn chants of the chapel. You drift forward into a colder, quieter chamber of history, and here the whispers turn into something more tangible. Children, not the metaphorical sons of the church, but real boys and girls born of papal liaisons. carrying the faces and mannerisms of their famous fathers. As you step closer, you feel the paradox pressing against your mind. How could the man who called himself Holy Father also be, quite literally, a father in ways the canon law forbade? Documented evidence confirms that several popes sired children. Pope Innocent VIII publicly acknowledged at least 8 offspring, arranging noble marriages for them and watching them weave themselves into Europe's ruling dynasties. Alexander VI, the infamous Rodrigo Borgia, proudly paraded his children Cesare, Giovanni, and Lucrezia, using them as pieces in his dynastic chess game. The irony drips thick. The papacy, meant to symbolize celibacy and spiritual authority, became a launchpad for family fortunes that rivaled the great houses of Europe. It is tempting to imagine a quiet nursery tucked inside the papal palace. The smell of warm milk, the creak of cradles, the soft giggles of toddlers tumbling across tiled floors, sounds you would expect in a noble household but strange in the residence of the Vicar of Christ. Servants hush their laughter, knowing the children's presence is both undeniable and inconvenient. Everyone in Rome knows who their fathers are, even if official documents delicately call them nephews. One particularly curious anecdote tells of Pope Innocent VIII accepting a dowry of 100,000 ducats for his illegitimate daughter's marriage to a Roman nobleman. The wedding was lavish, filled with torches, music, and fountains spilling wine, all funded by the papal treasury. Ordinary Romans lined the streets to watch, some marveling at the splendor, others muttering that their offerings to the church were being poured into a festival of hypocrisy. Can you hear those mutters beneath the music, the bitterness hiding under the applause? Writers of the period struggled to decide whether to condemn or simply record these facts. Some noted them with clinical precision, listing the names and marriages as they would for any prince's household. Others scrawled venomous satire, painting the papal palace as a brothel in disguise, where holy vestments covered very earthly appetites. And still others, particularly loyal clerics, tried to justify it by claiming these children were blessings of providence, signs of God's mysterious will. The interpretations collided like cymbals in a cacophony of moral confusion. If you close your eyes, you can picture one of these children, perhaps Cesare Borgia, striding through the corridors of power with his father's confident gait. His crimson cloak swishes behind him, his hand rests on the hilt of a jeweled sword, and his eyes gleam with ambition. Everyone knows whose son he is. Everyone understands that his power flows not from birthright alone, but from the papal throne. You feel the weight of his destiny pressing against the marble walls. The ripple effect of these children stretched far beyond Rome. By marrying them into noble families, popes built alliances that secured their political agendas. Lucrezia Borgia became Duchess in Ferrara, her marriages binding Rome to northern Italy's powerful courts. Giovanni Borgia received lands and titles that extended papal influence. The papal nursery was not just a family space, it was a factory for political leverage, producing offspring who could carry papal interests into every corner of Europe. Contemporaries often joked darkly about the Church's supposed chastity. A biting line circulated in Rome: "The Holy Father keeps many sons." You can imagine the smirk of a tavern bard singing this to a half-drunken crowd, while the listeners chuckle nervously, knowing such a jest could bring punishment if repeated in the wrong company. Humor and scandal mingled together, creating a culture where everyone knew the truth but cloaked it in laughter and rumor. Think of the sensory details. A baptismal font carved of marble, water rippling as an infant is christened under candlelight. The child's godparents are cardinals, their rings glinting as they trace the sign of the cross. The irony is thick. The Pope blesses the font, his own offspring in swaddling cloth, while the faithful outside chant about purity and virginity. The contradictions settle into your bones like a weight you can't shake off. Modern historians disagree on the legacy of these children. Some portray them as tragic figures caught between legitimacy and shame, struggling under the shadow of their father's tiara. Others emphasize their agency, pointing to how the Borgias and Medici descendants carved out powerful roles of their own. Were they pawns in their father's games, or were they queens and knights in their own right? The debate lingers, much like the scent of incense after the candles have been extinguished. What is certain is that illegitimate papal children eroded the moral high ground the Church claimed. Each cradle in the Lateran chipped away at the image of celibacy. Each noble marriage reminded the world that the Pope was a man like any other, desiring, fathering, scheming. The very act of denying the children's existence in official records made their presence more glaring, like shadows cast longer by the attempt to conceal the flame. As you let the scene fade, the image that stays with you is not of a pope on his throne, but of a small child chasing a ball across the marble floor of the papal palace, laughter ringing where solemn hymns once echoed. That simple sound carries the weight of centuries of scandal, an echo that tells you the papacy was never just about prayers and rituals, but about flesh and blood, lineage and ambition. You wander further into the velvet shadows of history, and suddenly find yourself stepping into one of the most notorious households of all the Borgias. The air grows heavier, perfumed with orange blossoms and sweat, and every whisper feels like it carries both temptation and danger. This is not a rumor tucked in dusty chronicles. This is a dynasty that paraded its appetites in full view, leaving Europe both fascinated and horrified. Rodrigo Borgia, who ascended the papal throne as Alexander VI in 1492, is often painted as the embodiment of scandal. He had several acknowledged children, including the infamous Cesare, Giovanni, and Lucrezia Borgia. His court was not a cloister of solemn prayer, but a vibrant theatre where politics, family, and pleasure collided. Ambassadors recorded with astonishment how the Pope openly dined with his children, boasted of their marriages, and positioned them in offices of immense power. For many, this display confirmed what they long suspected, that the papacy had become a family dynasty, more akin to a princely court than a spiritual seat. One memorable event illustrates the excess. Chroniclers describe a banquet in the Vatican where courtesans danced on the tables, their laughter mingling with the notes of lutes and drums. Gold coins were scattered across the marble floor for them to scramble after, and the spectacle was known mockingly as the banquet of chestnuts. The image lingers, half-naked dancers crawling on all fours to collect chestnuts while cardinals and nobles watched, entertained. Was it exaggerated by enemies of the Borgias? Possibly. But the rumor traveled far, etched into the imagination of Europe, painting Alexander's reign in lurid colors. What makes the Borgia story even more captivating is the way family loyalty and scandal were inseparable. Cesare, raised for a career in the church, discarded his cardinal's robes to become a ruthless military leader, carving out territories for his family with sword and blood. Lucrezia, long maligned as a seductress, was married 3 times into powerful families, serving as both political pawn and influential duchess. Giovanni, less fortunate, died mysteriously, his body found floating in the Tiber, sparking whispers of betrayal and murder. The papal palace became a stage for soap opera-like dramas where desire and ambition fed one another. Travelers and chroniclers could not resist embellishing the tale. Some accused the Borgias of incest, others of poisonings, others of black masses staged in candlelit chambers. Whether these stories were true hardly mattered. They cemented the Borgia name as a byword for corruption and lust. To this day, their legend clings to every mention of Alexander VI. Even Shakespeare's audiences would have shivered at the idea of such a pope, whose family seemed lifted from the pages of a Gothic tragedy. Imagine the sensory impact of that court. The smell of roasted meats and spiced wine, mingled with incense that failed to mask the musk of sweat and perfume. The feel of silken cushions pressed beneath courtesans as they reclined. The sight of crimson robes brushing against jeweled gowns, a kaleidoscope of color and flesh moving under torchlight. The Vatican, supposedly the holiest palace in the world, transformed into a carnival of indulgence. Observers at the time reacted with a mix of outrage and fascination. Some ambassadors wrote with disdain, warning their sovereigns of Rome's moral decay. Others wrote with thinly veiled envy, marveling at the riches and pleasures flowing through papal hands. For common Romans, the Borgias became characters in daily gossip, part scandal, part entertainment, their escapades retold in taverns and markets with wide eyes and knowing smirks. Modern historians cannot agree on how much of the legend is true. Was the banquet of chestnuts a real event, or an invention by enemies seeking to blacken the Borgias' reputation? Were accusations of incest grounded in fact, or merely the fevered fantasies of rivals? Some argue that the Borgias were no worse than other Renaissance dynasties, merely more flamboyant and less discreet. Others insist that the family's brazen disregard for decorum marked a true low point for the papacy. Whatever the verdict, the image has endured like a stain on silk, impossible to wash away. You pause for a moment and consider Lucrezia Borgia, often cast as either a femme fatale or a helpless pawn. Her portraits show a composed, pale woman with golden hair and delicate features. In her eyes, though, you sense intelligence and resilience. Married off repeatedly to secure alliances, she adapted to each role, eventually ruling Ferrara with a steadiness that belied the slander thrown her way. Was she a victim of propaganda, or a quiet manipulator in her own right? The ambiguity makes her story linger long after the banquet lamps are extinguished. The Borgias left their mark not only through scandal, but through art and architecture. Alexander VI commissioned grand works, expanded the Vatican's grandeur, and patronized artists who would shape the Renaissance. Even in their decadence, the Borgias contributed to the splendor of Rome, leaving behind frescoes, chapels, and palaces that still stand. You feel the contradiction pressing on you. Sin and beauty, corruption and creativity, mingled inseparably in the papal court. As you let the images fade, you realize why the Borgia household became a touchstone for centuries of gossip and condemnation. They embodied the very fears people had about the papacy, that power unchecked by humility would descend into debauchery, that the shepherds of souls were secretly wolves in velvet robes. Whether the tales were exaggerated or not, the Borgias created a legend so powerful it eclipsed even the facts. So you drift on, past their feasts and whispers, their children and betrayals, carrying with you the heavy perfume of a court where rumor and reality blurred into one long, intoxicating scandal. The Borgias remind you that in the story of medieval popes, the line between history and theatre is vanishingly thin, and sometimes the performance matters more than the truth. You wander deeper into the echo of Renaissance Rome, and now the air thickens with a different aroma. Roasted meats, honey-glazed fruits, steaming pots of spiced wine, and something else, something more primal. The feasts of the papal court were not simply dinners, they were pageants of wealth, and at times, of flesh. You hear the hum of conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter, the scrape of knives across platters, and the slosh of wine spilled onto marble floors. These gatherings, whether exaggerated by rumor or faithfully recorded, became symbols of the blurred line between sanctity and spectacle. The records make it clear that papal banquets were extraordinary affairs. Alexander VI, Julius II, and Leo X are all remembered for hosting meals that seemed less like pious celebrations and more like the excesses of kings. Whole tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, pheasants stuffed with spices, candied almonds shaped into mythical beasts, and rivers of imported wine flowing from ornate pitchers. The papal household consumed as though the treasury were bottomless. The irony was not lost on Rome's poor, who begged outside the palace gates while inside. Delicacies were fed even to hunting dogs. Contemporary observers sometimes describe the entertainments that accompanied these feasts. Dancers twirling with bells on their ankles, musicians plucking lutes while masked jesters performed bawdy skits, and, in some cases, courtesans providing diversions that were only half concealed. You can picture yourself reclining on a cushioned bench, half dizzy from the smell of roasting meat and strong wine, and suddenly realizing that what you're watching in the papal palace would look more at home in a nobleman's private pleasure garden. One colorful anecdote involves Pope Leo X, who was said to delight in exotic animals at his banquets. Lions, leopards, and even elephants paraded before his guests. Imagine feasting on roast capon while an elephant, draped in embroidered cloth, trumpets beside you. The scene is both absurd and magnificent, a reminder that spectacle mattered as much as substance. The papacy projected its wealth not only in rituals of worship but also in these theatrical displays, where food, performance, and sometimes scandal intertwined. Was every story true? That question lingers like incense smoke. Some chroniclers were enemies of Rome, eager to paint the popes as gluttons and libertines. Others, however, were eyewitnesses who described the feasts in letters and diaries. Whether embellished or not, the imagery carried its own power. Europe imagined Rome as a place where holiness and hedonism coexisted at the same table, each bite of meat seasoned with hypocrisy. Close your eyes for a moment and let yourself drift into such a feast. The clamour of voices echoes through gilded halls, torches flicker against frescoes of saints, and the mingled scents of cinnamon, clove, and roasting pork swell until you almost feel dizzy. At the head of the table, the Pope raises his goblet. His ring catches the candlelight. The guests cheer, but beneath the cheer is an undercurrent of unease. Everyone knows the Church preaches restraint, yet here restraint has vanished into gluttony and indulgence. At times, these feasts veered into shocking theatrics. Accounts survive of competitions staged for guests' amusement, where courtesans were encouraged to perform suggestive dances or games in front of the papal household. Whether this was the invention of malicious chroniclers or a glimpse of uncomfortable truth, it shaped how people viewed the papacy. The notion that sacred walls echoed with such laughter fed the growing belief that reform was not only desirable but inevitable. One fascinating detail comes from the way these banquets blurred sacred and profane. Some reports claim that masses were sometimes celebrated immediately before or after feasting, blending prayer with indulgence in a single sequence of events. Imagine kneeling for a blessing only to rise moments later to watch jesters juggle fruit while a courtesan whispers in a cardinal's ear. The juxtaposition is jarring, yet in papal Rome it made sense. Ceremony and indulgence were two faces of the same coin. Writers of the period could not resist exaggerating the contrast. Preachers thundered that such feasts mocked the Last Supper, turning Christ's sacrifice into a parody of appetite. Satirists penned verses imagining Christ returning to Rome, only to find his vicar drowning in wine. And ordinary people, hearing fragments of these stories, spread them in taverns and marketplaces, their voices tinged with both scandal and fascination. The sensory richness of these nights is almost overwhelming. You imagine the cool marble beneath your feet sticky with spilled wine, the roar of applause as dancers whirl, the sudden silence when the Pope raises his hand for another toast. Somewhere in the crowd, a mistress glances toward him, her smile both tender and calculating. In that moment, the feast is not just food and drink, it is a theatre of power, desire, and politics played out under chandeliers. Modern scholars argue endlessly about these accounts. Some view them as exaggerated propaganda spread by Protestant reformers eager to expose Rome's corruption. Others believe the sheer consistency of the reports indicates that at least some of the feasts truly crossed into shocking territory. Were they isolated excesses or a regular feature of papal life? The answer remains elusive, leaving you suspended between rumor and reality. And yet, perhaps the most striking truth is how these stories endured. Even if half were false, their survival shaped Europe's perception of the papacy. To the faithful in distant lands, Rome seemed less like a holy city and more like a gilded carnival where flesh and faith mixed too freely. The feasts, whether real or imagined, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Church, a banquet of contradictions where hunger and holiness sat uncomfortably together. As you let the imagery soften in your mind, the last sound that lingers is laughter soft, mocking, echoing off marble walls. The feasts of flesh and faith fade into the night, leaving behind a bitter aftertaste that even the sweetest wine cannot wash away. And you realize, as you drift further into the story, that these tables set the stage for even darker spectacles to come. You linger in the flickering light of those feasts, but now the scene grows darker, heavier, almost suffocating. You've watched dancers and jesters parade through the papal halls, yet what comes next slides into something more secretive, more unsettling. The whispers speak not merely of banquets, but of entire nights devoted to excess. The word orgy clings to these tales like smoke that refuses to clear. Within the holy precincts of Rome, behind locked doors and shuttered windows, the air was said to shimmer with the mingled breath of cardinals, courtesans, and even the Pope himself. Contemporary chronicles describe episodes that blur the line between fact and scandalous invention. One notorious account concerns the infamous banquet of chestnuts, allegedly held in 1501 at the Vatican. Courtesans, it was claimed, were invited to crawl on the floor to pick up roasted chestnuts scattered among candelabra, their movements performed as entertainment for papal guests. The Pope's own family, the Borgias, was accused of presiding over the spectacle. Whether fully true or not, the image has remained burned into Europe's imagination. The holiest palace in Christendom transformed into a stage of wanton indulgence. The detail is grotesquely vivid if you let yourself picture it. Wax dripping onto bare skin, laughter echoing against frescoed walls, and the slap of flesh on marble as revelry replaced restraint. Musicians plucked strings in the corner while goblets toppled, spilling red wine like blood across the floor. Cardinals watched with flushed faces, their rings glinting in the firelight, while the courtesans, adorned with little more than jewels, laughed breathlessly. It is an image that makes you shiver, even as you try to imagine it quietly, half dreaming, as though your own eyes shouldn't really be seeing this. Some contemporaries wrote of these nights in tones of horror, insisting that Rome had turned into a new Babylon. Preachers warned that divine wrath would surely follow, that such desecration of sacred space could not go unpunished. Others, however, recorded the tales almost gleefully, relishing every sordid detail, as though they too were entertained. Propaganda or reality, it almost doesn't matter for the scandal-shaped perception. Consider the role of rumour. A single story whispered in a Roman tavern could travel by ambassador's letter to Paris, be retold in a Venetian salon, and then appear in a German pamphlet illustrated with crude woodcuts. By the time it reached the north, the Vatican orgy had grown into a festival of blasphemy. Priests in masks, cardinals competing in debauchery, even the suggestion of ritual mockeries of Christian sacraments. You can almost hear the gasp of a merchant in Nuremberg reading such tales by candlelight, muttering that the Pope must surely be Antichrist himself. Was any of this precisely true? Modern researchers can't agree. Some argue that the sources were exaggerated slanders spread by enemies of the Borgias and later by Protestant reformers. Others point out that the consistency of reports and the long tradition of complaints about clerical excess suggests there was at least a foundation of truth. The banquet may not have looked exactly as described, but that the papal court tolerated shocking spectacles seems undeniable. Let yourself pause and imagine the sensory atmosphere of such a night. Perfume lingers in the air, mingling with the acrid smoke of tallow candles. The music is relentless drums, lutes, tambourines beating out rhythms more suited to carnival than cloister. Servants scurry barefoot across the marble floors, carrying trays of wine that slosh dangerously close to spilling. In one corner, two courtesans laugh as they tease a cardinal, pulling at his sleeves, while across the room a group of nobles applaud a crude performance staged by the Pope's own guards. The sacred and the profane crash together until the very air feels thick with contradiction. One forgotten but intriguing detail comes from an ambassador's letter hinting that participants in these gatherings were rewarded with valuable gifts, rings, silks, or even official positions within the papal administration. Imagine that. Indulgence as currency, pleasure exchanged for power, scandal woven directly into the machinery of governance. It is almost too theatrical to believe, and yet it fits the world you're wandering through, where desire and politics were inseparable. The symbolic damage was enormous. Even if only a fraction of these tales were accurate, they eroded the Church's moral authority. To hear that priests cavorted like satyrs in the Vatican itself was to feel that holiness had been betrayed. Pilgrims who trudged barefoot to Rome dreamed of relics and blessings, yet outside the palace walls, the gossip was of orgies behind closed doors. The dissonance made faith feel brittle, like glass under strain. As you let your thoughts wander, You begin to understand why later reformers seized upon these stories with such fury. For Martin Luther and his followers, the papal orgies were proof that Rome was beyond redemption. The very heart of Christendom was rotted through. Pamphlets depicted popes as beasts of lust, their tiaras crooked on their heads as they presided over unholy games. In this way, whether true or exaggerated, the orgy tales became fuel for revolution. And yet, step closer with a gentler eye, and you see the human fragility within the scandal. Men sworn to celibacy, trapped in the burden of impossible vows, surrounded by wealth, temptation, and unchecked power. Women navigating those same corridors, some forced by circumstance, others eager to seize opportunities, all of them walking a dangerous line between influence and ruin. It doesn't excuse the scandal, but it softens it, reminding you that history is rarely black and white. It is lived by flawed, yearning people. Picture the aftermath of such a night. The torches burned low, smoke clinging to the ceiling like a dark veil. The courtesans slip away through side doors, laughter trailing behind them. Cardinals stumble out into the dawn air, their robes disheveled, the streets already filling with pilgrims. And in some quiet chamber, the Pope himself reclines, weary but satisfied, already planning alliances and treaties, while the city buzzes with rumor. The holy and the profane have intertwined yet again, leaving behind an uneasy silence. As you breathe in the last traces of that vision, you realize that the notion of orgies in holy halls is not simply a scandalous rumor, but a symbol. It stands for the excesses of unchecked authority, the frailty of vows broken by temptation, and the way rumor itself can reshape history. You carry the echo with you as you drift onward, knowing the shadows of these nights still darken the memory of the papacy centuries later. The candles flicker low now, and as you continue wandering through these chambers of memory, you notice that indulgence was never confined to flesh alone. The hunger of the papacy extended also to gold and coin. Desire and wealth were so deeply entangled that one fed the other, creating a cycle of corruption that could not be easily broken. The phrase that rises to your lips is simple but unsettling. Salvation itself seemed purchasable, and often the price was tied not only to indulgences of money but to the indulgences of the body. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences, the Church's mechanism for forgiving sins in exchange for penance, had grown into a sprawling financial enterprise. Popes sanctioned the sale of indulgences across Europe, collecting enormous sums to fund palaces, armies, and crusades. Officially, these indulgences were spiritual instruments, meant to draw the faithful closer to heaven. In practice, they became a kind of currency, traded and exploited. The tension between theology and economy was sharp enough to cut like glass. You imagine a papal envoy standing in a town square, parchment in hand, declaring that anyone who purchased this slip of paper would have years cut from their time in purgatory. The crowd surges forward, coins clinking, peasants clutching their purses, desperate for salvation. Now imagine how quickly rumors spread that these same coins lined the pockets of clerics who lived like princes, dining on roasted swan and commissioning frescoes. The contrast must have been unbearable. It wasn't only money that greased the system. Accounts survive of priests who offered absolution not for coin but for favors, sometimes political, sometimes carnal. The merging of spiritual authority with intimate transgression created a corruption more insidious than mere greed. You can picture a confessor leaning in, whispering absolution in exchange for something unspeakably inappropriate, turning the confessional booth into a cage of manipulation. The faithful walked in with guilt and left with scars, carrying a secret wound. Reports of this behavior fueled outrage. Preachers thundered that indulgences were no longer acts of mercy, but acts of exploitation. Reformist voices began to grow louder, accusing the papacy of selling heaven itself while indulging in earthly pleasures. The story of Johann Tetzel, the Dominican friar whose salesmanship would spark Martin Luther's fury, captures the atmosphere perfectly. His jingle, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs," might have been crafted for marketing, but in the mouths of critics, It sounded like a cruel parody. You stepped back and take in the larger scene. Rome itself glittered with wealth. Marble halls polished, frescoes glowing with pigments made from crushed lapis lazuli, golden candlesticks casting light on jeweled altars. Yet outside those walls, the streets stank of sewage, beggars rattled their bowls, and pilgrims slept in doorways. The contradiction burned into people's minds. How could the church preach humility and chastity while flaunting wealth gathered through indulgences and, sometimes, through scandalous liaisons? One curious anecdote floats to the surface. Pope Sixtus IV, whose pontificate is remembered for commissioning the Sistine Chapel, also authorized a special tax on brothels in Rome. The revenue was justified as a way of controlling vice, but the irony was too sharp to miss. The head of Christendom drew profit from the very sins he was meant to condemn. The smell of hypocrisy wafted stronger than incense, and the people of Rome whispered about it over their wine cups. Ambassadors at the papal court often recorded these contradictions with a mixture of fascination and disgust. In their letters you see the duality. One line marveling at the art and splendor of the papal chapels, the next sneering at the venality and lust that funded it all. Imagine being a diplomat from a pious kingdom, sitting at a papal banquet where indulgence papers are signed while courtesans lounge nearby. Your quill scratches across parchment, but in your heart you feel the unease of a world tilted out of balance. Modern historians view this period as the tipping point. The Church had always struggled with balancing spiritual ideals and worldly power, but the fusion of sexual scandal with financial exploitation became too much to ignore. The perception was damning. Salvation had been commodified, intimacy corrupted, vows of chastity broken, and the treasury swollen. Whether each story was true or exaggerated hardly mattered. The image was enough to shake the faith of millions. Pause here and let yourself imagine the sensory contrasts. The heavy scent of wax and roses in St. Peter's Basilica, the grand hymns soaring from the choir, and outside, the hawker's cry as indulgence slips are sold like trinkets. The rustle of coins in a velvet purse, followed by the rustle of sheets in a cardinal's chamber. The blending of sound and smell reveals the true scandal, not that individual popes faltered, but that the entire system seemed soaked in contradiction. And beneath it all was the human element, the hunger for forgiveness. People longed for assurance, for the promise that their souls would be safe. That longing was exploited ruthlessly, both by men chasing money and by men chasing pleasure. The result was a legacy of bitterness that could never be fully erased. As you drift into silence, the realization crystallizes. The papal world was not just about feasting and mistresses, it was about the monetization of sin itself, where salvation was bartered like cloth in a marketplace. Desire and greed walked hand in hand, leaving behind a trail of disillusionment. The laughter from those indulgent halls fades into echoes, and you sense the growing storm outside, a storm that would one day erupt into the fire of reformation. The air in the corridors turns colder as you move on, yet the sound of footsteps grows louder, not the tread of armored guards or cardinals in scarlet robes, but the softer shuffle of women drawn into papal intrigues. Tonight you glimpse not only mistresses but wives, daughters, and widows, maneuvered like pawns across the board of Roman politics. To understand the papal court, you must understand how women were used as instruments of diplomacy, often caught in webs spun by men who saw their bodies as tokens of exchange. Contemporary accounts make clear that noble families competed for influence by offering their daughters to the papal household. Sometimes these arrangements were overt, a marriage alliance that bound a family's fortune to Rome. Other times, they were more clandestine, a widow brought to the palace under the guise of service, a cousin or household companion, who conveniently became the Pope's intimate confidant. These women's roles shifted depending on the needs of the moment, sometimes respected, sometimes hidden, but always vulnerable to the tides of power. Take the case of Vannozza dei Catanei, the long-term mistress of Pope Alexander VI. Far from being a nameless figure in the shadows, she was a woman of property who raised the Pope's children, Cesare, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and others in comfort. She maneuvered carefully, balancing her position with discretion and ambition. Though never formally acknowledged as his wife, she received estates and protection, her name whispered with both envy and scorn across Rome. You can picture her walking the gardens of her villa, head held high, while servants bowed deeply. Her influence was undeniable, though always precarious. There are smaller stories too, nearly forgotten but telling. Letters from the 15th century describe how widows of noble Roman families were introduced to the papal court, sometimes under the pretext of providing companionship or service. These women, once cast aside by society, found themselves thrust into dangerous proximity to power. For them, intimacy with a pope or cardinal could mean sudden wealth and security, but also peril. A shift in favor could strip away everything, leaving them more destitute than before. And then there were daughters. Imagine the paradox of a pope arranging the marriage of his own child. Cesare, Borgia's sister, Lucrezia, was wed 3 times into noble families, her unions sealing political alliances from Naples to Ferrara. To the outside world, her role was simply that of dutiful daughter and wife. Yet behind closed doors, rumors swirled of manipulation and scandal. Was she a willing accomplice in her father's designs, or a victim of circumstance forced to play roles scripted by men? The truth, as always, slips between the cracks of gossip and reality. One striking episode tells of Pope Innocent VIII marrying off his illegitimate daughter to a powerful Roman baron, the celebration funded by papal coffers. The wedding was a spectacle of jewels, torches, and processions. Outside the palace, the poor grumbled that their alms had been turned into silk gowns and feasts for the elite. Can you hear the resentment echoing in the streets, even as music and laughter drifted from the banquet hall? Accounts from ambassadors reinforce this sense of manipulation. A Venetian envoy once noted dryly that the Pope's decisions could often be traced through the smiles of women in his household. The remark drips with cynicism, yet it captures the perception of the time that women around the Pope were not simply companions but intermediaries through whom politics were conducted. Influence might be whispered in a bedchamber and confirmed in a council the next morning. Historians today debate the agency of these women. Were they powerless victims, exploited for the ambitions of men, or were some of them skilled players in their own right, using intimacy to carve out influence in a world that denied them formal power? The truth likely varies from figure to figure. Venosa seems to have lived with stability and respect, while others faded into obscurity, their names lost even as their bodies fueled dynastic politics. Pause with me in one imagined chamber. The scent of jasmine drifts from a courtyard garden. A woman sits at a gilded mirror, her hair being braided by a servant. She is preparing to attend the Pope at supper, not because she longs for him, but because her family's fortune depends on it. Her fingers tremble as she clasps a necklace around her throat. She knows the stakes. If she pleases him, her brothers gain office. If she fails, disgrace could swallow them all. The weight of politics rests on her shoulders like the weight of those pearls. Whispers of corruption turned ever sharper when such women were given estates, titles, or incomes funded by papal taxes. To ordinary Romans it felt like betrayal. Why should their offerings to the church support mistresses or the dowries of papal daughters? The dissonance between spiritual teachings and worldly practice grew so wide it seemed irreconcilable. And yet, woven through the scandal is something more human. These women were not abstractions. They laughed, they cried, they navigated danger with whatever tools they had. Some may have found affection in unlikely places, others lived with constant fear. The papal court, for all its gilded splendor, was a cage where women were both ornament and strategist, condemned by rumor yet essential to the politics of Rome. By the 16th century, satirists lampooned these arrangements mercilessly. Plays and pamphlets mocked the papal palace as a brothel disguised investments, its women portrayed as both temptresses and victims. Reformers seized on these images, presenting them as proof of Rome's decadence. Yet even in ridicule, the women remain curiously absent as individuals, their stories flattened into caricatures. Only glimpses, letters, property records, portraits remind us that they were real people navigating impossible contradictions. As you drift into silence, one sound lingers. The faint rustle of silk as a woman walks down a corridor, her footsteps measured, her fate uncertain. In her shadow lies the truth of the papacy's entanglement with women, sometimes mistresses, sometimes pawns, sometimes power brokers in their own right. Their presence complicates the story, reminding you that papal corruption was never just about men failing vows, but about entire families and dynasties built on the fragile shoulders of women. You turn a corner in this long, candlelit corridor of papal scandal, and now the shadows grow sharper. The laughter and feasting you have witnessed fade into something more dangerous, where the stakes are no longer just whispers of hypocrisy but matters of life and death. Desire, jealousy, and power could combust into lethal outcomes, and in Rome, love affairs sometimes ended with poison or daggers. Here, in the heart of Christendom, intimacy could become an assassin's blade. The chronicles of the 15th and 16th centuries abound, with rumors of papal households entangled in plots where passion was inseparable from intrigue. The Borgias, again, sit at the center of these tales. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, was accused of using poison against rivals at feasts, while his children were said to perfect the art of lacing wine with deadly draughts. Was it truth or malicious propaganda? Hard to say, but the frequency of such stories reveals how deeply people associated the papacy of that era with seduction and danger. One story stands out, whispered with relish in taverns. An enemy of the Borgias was supposedly invited to supper, served wine in a golden cup, and collapsed before dessert. The tale insists that courtesans were present at the banquet, their laughter mingling with the man's gasps as the poison took effect. Whether exaggerated or not, the imagery was powerful: pleasure and death entwined in the same breath, with Rome as the stage. You can almost smell it, the sweet perfume of roses on the courtesans, the heavy scent of roasted pheasant, and beneath it all the faint bitterness of something acrid dissolving in wine. Imagine lifting a goblet to your lips, catching a whiff of almonds, and wondering if it is simply the cook's confection or a final kiss of poison. Such was the paranoia that haunted the papal court. There are also stories of lovers themselves becoming instruments of betrayal. Some chroniclers wrote of women brought into the papal palace as companions who later turned spies, delivering secrets to rival factions. Picture a mistress lying in silken sheets, whispering sweet words to the pontiff, only to rise at dawn and pass his confidences to an ambitious cardinal. In an era when alliances shifted as quickly as the flicker of a candle, the intimacy of the bedroom was a dangerous arena. The case of Julia Farnese illustrates this danger. Known as La Bella Giulia, she became the mistress of Alexander VI while still a young noblewoman. Contemporary accounts claim her beauty was so radiant that she appeared in art as the Virgin Mary, a scandal in itself. But more intriguing is how her family leveraged her intimacy with the Pope. Her brother, Alessandro Farnese, was elevated to cardinal, a career made possible by his sister's influence. Was she a pawn, willingly used by her family? Or was she a strategist who understood the risks and played her hand with care? The debate lingers, wrapped in the smoke of rumor. The darker side of such arrangements was ever present. Poison was the weapon of choice in Renaissance Italy. Subtle and terrifying. It slipped invisibly into wine, fruit, or even gloves dusted with toxic powder. Lovers who fell from favor feared not only disgrace but also death. Imagine being a courtesan dismissed from papal chambers, your jewels confiscated, your family disgraced. One bitter sip could end the story before gossip had time to spread. Ambassadors recorded these rumors with fascination, often uncertain where fact ended and slander began. In their letters home, you see phrases like, "It is said," or "the people whisper." These caveats reveal how precarious the truth was, yet the repetition gave the stories weight. For foreign courts, Rome became synonymous not only with corruption, but with treachery disguised in velvet. Step into the sensory texture of such a night. A feast begins with music and song. the air heavy with incense and spiced wine. Courtesans dance, their jewelry clinking softly. The Pope raises his hand, and the room falls silent as servants pour wine into goblets. Guests drink, laughter rises, and then suddenly a man clutches his throat, his face twisting in agony. The music halts, courtesans gasp, and the smell of vomit mingles with the perfume. Whispers rush through the hall, poisoned, and just as quickly silence falls. No one dares speak aloud what everyone knows. Was it truth or theatre? Modern scholarship remains divided. Some argue the Borgia poisonings were exaggerated by enemies seeking to blacken their name. Others believe that at least a few of the tales carried kernels of fact after all. Poison was a common political tool in Renaissance Italy, not unique to Rome. The papacy, with its dynastic ambitions and bitter rivalries, was fertile ground for such rumours. Yet beyond the poison, there is the more intimate danger of passion itself. Lovers could turn into liabilities. A mistress who felt betrayed might reveal secrets. A discarded companion might find herself allied with a rival family. The papal household was a hothouse of emotions, desire, jealousy, resentment, all simmering under the marble ceilings. In such an atmosphere, betrayal was inevitable. You find yourself reflecting on the strange duality. The papacy was meant to symbolize divine constancy, yet its private world was marked by volatility. Affection could transform into enmity overnight, and the line between kiss and dagger was perilously thin. The Vatican was not only a palace of prayer, but also a theatre where passion and politics played their most dangerous scenes. As you let the images fade, the sound that lingers is not laughter, but the clink of a goblet being set down a little too heavily, the hush that falls when suspicion cuts through the room. You realize that the papal scandals were not merely about broken vows of celibacy, they were about how love, lust, and ambition could twist into lethal weapons. Poison, passion, and plots became the rhythm of Rome's secret nights, a reminder that even at the heart of Christendom, the dance of power was never safe. The air shifts again as you continue, the scent of Rome fading into something distinctly different. You find yourself in Avignon, that curious chapter of papal history when the throne of Peter was moved from the Eternal City to the banks of the Rhone in southern France. For nearly 70 years, from 1309 to 1377, the popes resided here instead of Rome, and this exile left deep marks not only on politics, but on the rhythms of indulgence. Step with me into Avignon's papal palace. Its walls still stand today, vast and fortress-like, a reminder that this was no humble retreat, but a lavish seat of power. Picture stone halls echoing with music, torches sputtering against frescoes, and servants carrying trays laden with meat and wine. Away from Rome's constant scrutiny, the court of Avignon acquired a reputation for comfort and extravagance. While some clerics sought to maintain dignity, others embraced the opportunity to enjoy a freer, more indulgent atmosphere. Contemporary observers described the Avignon papacy as wealthy and worldly. The French crown, eager to keep the papacy within its orbit, lavished gifts upon the popes, who in turn surrounded themselves with French cardinals, courtiers, and nobles. Local chroniclers complained that feasting, gambling, and love affairs were rampant in the palace, where evenings stretched into nights filled with music, laughter, and intrigue. Whether every detail was true or not, the nickname stuck. Avignon became known as the Babylonian captivity of the church, a phrase dripping with accusations of corruption. Consider the scene of a papal banquet here. Roasted peacocks with gilded feathers, goblets of Bordeaux wine, troubadours singing verses not of saints but of courtly love. The atmosphere was less austere, more like the court of a French duke. One writer noted with a touch of irony that Avignon has grown rich with cardinals, courtesans, and cooks, capturing the essence of a city transformed by the papal presence. Among the curiosities whispered about this period was the claim that certain cardinals maintained open households with women who acted as companions, their presence scarcely concealed. Letters from Italian envoys describe Avignon with disdain, mocking it as a place where the clergy lived like secular lords, hosting masquerades and indulging in luxuries imported from across Europe. For Italians, the papal departure was not only a political loss but also a moral one. They painted Avignon as a nest of sin, contrasting it with Rome's supposed sanctity, even though Rome itself was hardly innocent. The scholars of today remain divided on how much to believe. Some argue that the image of Avignon as decadent Babylon was exaggerated, propaganda spread by Italian critics, desperate to lure the papacy back to Rome. Others point to evidence of genuine indulgence, lavish building projects, conspicuous consumption, and the accumulation of wealth through the continued sale of benefices and indulgences. The truth is likely a blend. Avignon was both a centre of administration and a courtly playground, depending on which room of the palace you entered. Let your senses absorb the contradictions. The smell of incense drifts from a chapel where monks chant vespers, but down the hall you hear laughter from a salon where music and flirtation fill the night. The papal palace stands as a fortress, yet within its walls, restraint often gave way to desire. You might stumble upon a courtyard garden where roses bloom under the moonlight, courtiers strolling arm in arm, their whispers carrying secrets not meant for ears of stone saints carved nearby. One forgotten but intriguing story involves Pope Clement VI, who reigned in Avignon during the mid-14th century. Chroniclers accused him of maintaining a particularly luxurious court, even granting protection to prostitutes within the city, reasoning that their trade was necessary for keeping order. Imagine the paradox: the successor of Peter offering papal protection to brothels, justifying it as a form of civic management. To moralists, this was proof of Avignon's corruption. To pragmatists, it was simply governance. The Avignon years also produced satire. Poets and preachers described the papal court as drowning in wine, its clergy distracted by dice and dalliance. One biting verse compared the Pope's palace to a tavern where the sign outside read, "Forgiveness for sale." Even if exaggerated, such images stuck, becoming part of the cultural memory of this era. You walk slowly through these stone corridors in your imagination, feeling both the chill of the limestone and the warmth of torchlight on your skin. You hear a distant chant and, layered on top of it, a woman's laugh. That uneasy mixture defines the Avignon papacy. Sacred ritual entwined with secular pleasure, reformist criticism shadowed by indulgent reality. When the papacy finally returned to Rome in 1377 under Gregory XI, the reputation of Avignon lingered. Italians claimed that the sojourn in France had weakened the Church, opening the door to the Western schism that followed. And in memory, Avignon remained stained, a place where the Pope's household had indulged too freely, far from the stern gaze of Roman tradition. As you let this chapter fade into silence, the image left behind is of a great stone palace glowing under the moon, its towers both imposing and inviting. Within its walls, prayers rose with incense, but so too did songs of love and laughter of courtesans. The exile to Avignon was not merely a relocation of the papal seat. It was a season where indulgence took root in foreign soil, leaving behind a legacy of suspicion and scandal. You leave the stone halls of Avignon behind, but the echo of indulgence still clings to your ears. When the papacy returned to Rome, the Church did not step back into stability. Instead, the world fractured, and with it the papal throne itself. You now enter the time of the Great Schism, when rival claimants, one in Rome, another in Avignon, and eventually even a third in Pisa, each declared themselves the true pope. Imagine the confusion of pilgrims and princes alike, trying to decide which man actually held the keys to heaven. And in this chaos, temptation found fertile ground. The split began in 1378 after Gregory XI's death. The Roman crowd, desperate for an Italian pope, clamoured so fiercely that cardinals claimed they feared for their lives. They elected Urban VI, but his harshness alienated many. Soon, dissenting cardinals declared his election invalid and chose Clement VII in Avignon. For nearly 4 decades, Christendom was divided, with 2 papal courts, 2 administrations, 2 sets of excommunications, and a rivalry that spilled over into carnal excess. The accounts of this period reveal that both courts indulged themselves to compete for prestige. If Rome hosted lavish feasts, Avignon answered with even greater spectacles. If one pope elevated a mistress to prominence, the rival's court whispered of its own hidden delights. Pilgrims were bewildered, reformers outraged, and ordinary believers left to wonder whether heaven itself was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Consider the sensory dissonance. In Rome, torchlight gleams on ancient marble, where urban successors attempt to restore papal dignity, while courtesans drift through the streets near the Lateran, plying their trade under papal guards' indulgent eyes. In Avignon, the Rhone glitters under moonlight as cardinals sip wine in walled gardens, serenaded by troubadours, their laughter carrying through warm summer air. Which of these courts represented holiness? For many, the answer was neither. Rumours multiplied. Chroniclers whispered that each rival pontiff sought to outdo the other not only in wealth and politics but in private indulgence. One tale claimed that the Avignon court had become so entangled with French nobility that mistresses and daughters of barons roamed the papal palace as freely as courtiers. In Rome, detractors accused popes of fathering children while hurling excommunications at their French rivals. Whether entirely accurate or not, the duplicity was clear. Vows of chastity sounded hollow when competing thrones seemed driven by bloodlines and desire. The schism also brought satire to new heights. Poets mocked the popes as husbands of Babylon, comparing their rival courts to warring brothels competing for customers. You can almost hear a tavern ballad sung in Paris, verses dripping with sarcasm. Two heads wear the same crown, two mouths promise the same heaven, but both drink from the same cup of lust. The laughter carried bitterness, for these verses gave voice to disillusionment spreading through Europe. What's striking is how the schism blurred politics and passion. Because legitimacy was contested, both courts leaned heavily on family networks and alliances. Nephews, daughters, and mistresses became bargaining chips. A pope's offspring might marry into a noble family to secure loyalty, while his mistress's relatives might be rewarded with lands or bishoprics. Each rival pope sought to prove his court was more powerful, more prosperous, more desirable sometimes by flaunting the very behaviors critics condemned. Modern historians remain divided about how debauched these rival courts truly were. Some emphasize that administrative work continued, letters were issued, taxes collected, diplomacy maintained. Others point to evidence of escalating indulgence, arguing that the rivalry encouraged ostentation and loosened morals. What cannot be denied is the perception. To the faithful, it seemed that while they fasted and prayed, popes feasted and sinned. Imagine yourself as a pilgrim during this time, arriving in Rome barefoot, only to hear that your neighbours considered the Avignon Pope the true shepherd. You kneel to kiss relics, yet rumours swirl that the man in the Lateran shares his bed with a mistress and pours alms into her family's coffers. You feel the sting of betrayal, the confusion of divided authority, and the unease of a faith shaken by human weakness. The schism finally ended in 1417 at the Council of Constance, when rival claimants were deposed and Martin V was elected as the sole pope. Yet the damage had been done. The memory of competing thrones, both tainted by rumours of indulgence, lingered long after unity was restored. For many, the scandal confirmed that the papacy was as much a worldly court as a spiritual office. As you drift away from this turbulent period, one sound remains: the clash of two choirs singing in different cities, each proclaiming their pope, the true voice of Christ. But beneath the hymns, you still hear the softer echoes, laughter from mistresses' chambers, gossip in torchlit taverns, the clink of goblets in rival feasting halls. The schism was not just about divided authority. It was about how temptation thrives in times of fracture, and how desire seeps into every crack of human ambition. The corridors grow quieter now, but the unease does not fade. You leave behind the great rival thrones of the schism and turn your gaze toward the cloisters, those secluded spaces where monks and nuns were meant to embody purity, obedience, and discipline. Yet the papal court's indulgence trickled down like spilled wine, staining even the walls of monasteries. What should have been sanctuaries of silence often became backdrops for scandal. Documents from the late Middle Ages reveal a persistent problem. Convents and monasteries became entangled with worldly appetites. While many communities upheld their vows with sincerity, others fell under the sway of papal indulgence, wealth, and favoritism. The higher clergy's behavior set a precedent, and the message was clear. If popes themselves kept mistresses and fathered children, why should monks and nuns be held to harsher account? One revealing episode concerns the convent of San Sisto in Rome. Reports from the 15th century accuse some nuns there of abandoning strict enclosure, entertaining visitors, and living with a level of comfort that shocked reformers. Satirists joked that these cloisters were more like salons, where noble families placed their daughters not for holiness but for convenience. Imagine peering into a courtyard where women in veils laugh too loudly, perfume drifting where incense should be, as courtiers slip through side gates for midnight visits. The case of Pope Sixtus IV casts further light. He granted indulgences and privileges to certain monasteries, many of which were accused of corruption. Chroniclers claim that some abbots grew rich from rents and taxes, while their monks indulged in feasting, gambling, and worse. A sharp-tongued critic of the time wrote, "They chant psalms at dawn and drink wine at dusk, and in between they forget their vows entirely." The remark captures the sense of disillusion that spread like smoke. You can almost feel the sensory contrast. Picture a monastery cloister at night. The air cool, the fountain in the courtyard murmuring softly. Yet behind one window, light flickers and laughter carries, breaking the stillness. A nun leans close to a visitor, their words barely audible but intimate enough. Another window reveals a monk rolling dice, the clatter echoing against the stone. The ideals of poverty and chastity dissolve into the reality of human weakness. Stories like these filtered through Europe, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes grounded in fact. Reformers seized upon them as evidence that the entire church was sinking into decadence. Preachers thundered that monasteries had become brothels, that nuns bore children in secret, that abbots lived like lords. Was every claim true? Certainly not. Yet enough truth lay beneath the rhetoric to sting. Investigations did uncover cases of illicit relationships, financial mismanagement, and worldly indulgence. The damage to the church's reputation was immense. A curious example comes from the nuns of Santa Maria della Scala in Siena. Local gossip insisted that the convent's reputation was so tarnished that families joked about sending daughters there as a safe way to climb into papal favor. Whether wholly accurate or not, the jest reveals how people perceived cloisters less as places of sanctity and more as extensions of papal patronage networks. The papacy tried at times to correct these abuses. Councils issued decrees demanding stricter enclosure, stricter financial audits, stricter adherence to vows. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. When popes themselves were accused of maintaining mistresses and lavishing wealth on their illegitimate children, their commands for reform rang hollow. It was like a wine-soaked host lecturing guests on sobriety, the hypocrisy too evident to ignore. Modern scholars wrestle with this legacy. Some stress that we must not overlook the countless monks and nuns who lived faithfully, who prayed sincerely, who resisted the tide of corruption. Others argue that the prevalence of scandals was symptomatic of a wider culture of laxity, encouraged by the example of Rome itself. The debate remains unsettled, but the perception of monastic corruption helped fuel the call for sweeping reform in the 16th century. Imagine the texture of a whispered sermon in a small town far from Rome. A preacher leans close to his flock and says, "Even the nuns in the city are mothers now. Even the monks keep concubines. If this is the state of Christ's servants, what hope have we?" The congregation murmurs uneasily, the smell of tallow candles heavy in the air. Such moments sowed seeds of doubt that would soon grow into rebellion. And yet, within the scandal, you sense the humanity. Monks and nuns were not angels but men and women, many forced into cloisters by family decisions rather than personal choice. Some craved affection, some longed for freedom, some succumbed to the same temptations that plagued their leaders. Their failings do not erase their humanity, they reveal it. As you step back into silence, the sound that lingers is not the chant of monks or the prayers of nuns, but the faint murmur of broken vows, soft, secret, carried through stone corridors like draughts of cold air. You realize that papal indulgence did not remain contained within palaces. It seeped outward, shaping the very institutions meant to embody purity. And in that seepage, you glimpse the slow erosion of trust that would one day erupt in fire. You step further along the shadowed passage, and the sound you hear now is not laughter or the clink of goblets, but the low, confessional murmur of voices behind latticed wood. The confessional, meant to be a sacred space of honesty and forgiveness, became, in too many stories, another arena where desire seeped through cracks. Instead of absolution, some penitents encountered exploitation. The practice of auricular confession had grown in prominence during the medieval period, with priests required to hear the private sins of their flock. The idea was noble, to cleanse the soul through speech and penance, but as you lean closer in imagination, the intimacy of whispered secrets in a dim booth created opportunities for abuse. The penitent, often a woman, knelt in vulnerability. The priest, cloaked in authority, held power over her eternal fate. In some cases, that imbalance of power turned dark. Contemporaries left scattered evidence of this transgression. In sermons and legal decrees, reformers warned about priests who turned confession into seduction. Tales circulated of confessors who asked probing, inappropriate questions about sexual sin, not for guidance but for titillation. Some women claimed they were pressured into granting favors in exchange for lighter penances or absolution. Whether common or rare, the idea was shocking enough to stain the reputation of confession itself. One striking case involved Bishop Adam of Caithness in the 13th century, accused of abusing his penitents so blatantly that chroniclers wrote of him with disgust. Another account, from a German preacher's handbook, warns confessors against asking curious and carnal questions, suggesting that such behavior had become troublingly frequent. You can almost hear the sharp tone of a friar railing in the pulpit. The confessional is not a lover's chamber, but many have made it so. Picture the sensory atmosphere. A woman kneels on cold stone, her breath shallow as she whispers sins. The air is heavy with the smell of wax and old wood. She expects comfort, yet instead feels the confessor's questions growing intrusive. The silence stretches, broken only by her hesitant answers. In that silence lies both her vulnerability and his power. It is a chilling reversal of the trust that confession was meant to embody. Satirists seized on this theme. In late medieval France, bawdy tales circulated about priests using confession as an excuse for intimacy. One fabliau, a kind of comedic poem, tells of a priest who convinces a young woman that her sins can be purged only through physical union. The tale is meant to be humorous, but beneath the laughter is a sharp sting of cynicism, an acknowledgement that sacred rituals were being parodied by reality. Reformers raged against such abuses. The fiery preacher Bernardino of Siena thundered that corrupt confessors were wolves dressed in vestments, devouring the very souls they were meant to shepherd. His words rang across Italian piazzas, echoing in the ears of the faithful who already harbored doubts about the Church. To hear that even confession, the most intimate sacrament, was tainted, confirmed for many that reform was desperately needed. Historians continue to argue about how widespread this problem was. Some suggest the stories were exaggerated, spread as propaganda by critics of the Church. Others believe that while not universal, enough cases occurred to justify the persistent complaints. The repetition of the accusation across different regions suggests it was more than mere fantasy. Like the tales of papal mistresses, these stories thrived because they struck a chord of plausibility. You might imagine an ordinary parishioner, torn between faith and fear, stepping hesitantly into the confessional. She believes in forgiveness, but dreads the questions, the scrutiny, the possibility of being shamed or exploited. The confessional becomes less a place of peace and more a place of unease. That feeling spread through towns and villages, chipping away at the trust the church depended upon. One curious note comes from manuals for confessors themselves. These guides explicitly warn priests not to linger on details of sexual sin, lest they themselves fall into temptation. The very need for such warnings suggests how common the risk was. You can almost hear the voice of a medieval instructor, weary and resigned, reminding young clerics, "Guard your eyes, your ears, and your heart, for what you hear may burn you as well." The legacy of this corruption lingered long. When reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin condemned the sacrament of confession, they drew on these tales of abuse. They argued that no man should wield such intimate power over another, for it inevitably led to exploitation. In this way, whispered sins in darkened chapels helped ignite the flames of Reformation. As you let the imagery fade, what remains is the sound of a penitent's breath, uncertain, trembling, caught between hope of forgiveness and fear of violation. The confessional, meant to cleanse the soul, too often became another chamber of scandal. And in that dissonance, you hear once again the recurring theme of papal Rome, sacred rituals collapsing under the weight of human desire. You drift further into this twilight corridor of memory, and now the sound that reaches your ears is the rustle of parchment, not the solemn turning of scripture, but the sly crackle of manuscripts hidden under cloaks, passed hand to hand like contraband. Here you encounter one of the stranger scandals of the papal courts, the circulation of forbidden texts, books that mingled theology with erotic imagination, satire with sacred parody. Behind the gilded doors of the Vatican and Avignon, where you expect only psalters and missals, you find works that read more like bawdy tavern songs or risque allegories than holy meditations. The late Middle Ages and Renaissance were centuries of copying and compiling. Scribes and humanists produced texts not only of theology, but of every curiosity: astrology, medicine, folklore, and sometimes outright erotica. Some of these manuscripts slipped into papal households, enjoyed by cardinals and their companions as evening diversions. The contradiction is startling. The guardians of orthodoxy thumbing through pages that mocked, or at least toyed with, the boundaries of propriety. One account describes Pope Pius II before his election, known as the humanist Ignaz Silvio Piccolomini, writing love stories and playful erotic tales in his youth. Though later, as Pope, he condemned such frivolity, the reputation clung to him. Imagine Rome's gossip. The very man who thundered against immorality once penned stories of amorous escapades. The irony would not have been lost on critics, who eagerly reminded readers of his youthful works whenever moral reform was preached. Another thread concerns libraries within papal households that contain texts of Ovid, Juvenal, and other classical authors celebrated for their frank depictions of love and lust. Humanists championed these works as part of the revival of antiquity, but to reformers, the presence of such texts in the Vatican smacked of hypocrisy. How could the Pope condemn bawdy literature when his own clerks copied and read it under papal roofs? Picture the sensory detail of such an evening. A fire crackles in a papal study, the smell of wax mingling with the sharp tang of ink. A group of courtiers lounge on cushions, sipping spiced wine, while one of them reads aloud from a manuscript filled with witty, ribald verses. Laughter ripples through the room, the kind of laughter that comes not only from humor but from the thrill of breaking taboos. In the background, the shadow of a crucifix flickers against the wall, as though watching silently. Some manuscripts were deliberately scandalous, collections of anti-clerical poetry, circulating in whispered copies, painted popes and bishops as lechers and gluttons. These texts were dangerous. Owning them could invite punishment. Yet they thrived, copied in secret by scribes who enjoyed the thrill of forbidden laughter. A few even slipped into papal circles where irony turned sharp. The very targets of satire were sometimes also its audience. Scholars debate whether these works were genuinely embraced by the papal elite or simply tolerated as curiosities. Some argue that popes and cardinals, steeped in humanist culture, saw no contradiction in enjoying Ovid's verses while still claiming moral authority. Others suggest that the circulation of bawdy texts inside holy precincts reveals a deeper rot, a willingness to indulge hypocrisy openly. Both views carry weight, and perhaps both were true at different times. A curious anecdote survives about Cardinal Bessarion's library in the 15th century. Among the treasures he collected were works of philosophy, science, and poetry, but nestled among them, scholars later noted, were texts with decidedly unholy themes. Though not directly tied to papal misdeeds, the presence of such material within the highest circles of the Church symbolized how porous the line between sacred and profane had become. Imagine, too, how these texts shaped rumor. A servant glimpses a manuscript of obscene verse on a cardinal's desk, whispers of it in the marketplace, and soon the story grows. The Pope himself reads books of filth. Whether true or not, the gossip clung. The perception of hypocrisy mattered more than the reality. The sensory atmosphere lingers, parchment dry and brittle under your fingertips, the faint metallic scent of ink, the hush of conspiratorial voices leaning close over a text, and then a burst of laughter that feels almost guilty. Books became another form of indulgence, intellectual rather than bodily, but no less dangerous to the Church's reputation. When reformers later condemned Rome, they drew not only on tales of mistresses and feasts, but also on stories of forbidden manuscripts. To them, the presence of such literature in papal courts was proof that the guardians of faith had abandoned purity altogether. Even if only a fraction of the rumors were true, the stain remained. As you let this image fade, what lingers is the faint sound of pages turning, carrying words both clever and scandalous, echoing in halls that were meant for prayer. You realize that the corruption of the papacy was not only physical or financial, it was also intellectual, a willingness to blur sacred boundaries for amusement. The forbidden books and bawdy jokes were not mere diversions. They were symptoms of a deeper malaise, laughter in the dark that would soon fuel flames of reform. You move onward, and the atmosphere brightens briefly, yet not with holiness. Instead, it glitters with the sheen of gold leaf, marble dust, and freshly painted frescoes. The Renaissance has dawned, and with it the papal court embraces not only politics and power, but also the revival of classical sensuality. You wander into chambers where the walls themselves shimmer with imagery saints painted in radiant colors. Yes, but also mythological figures with bare limbs, bodies twined in poses borrowed from pagan Rome. The spectacle of vice now arrives dressed in beauty. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the popes had become some of the greatest patrons of the Renaissance. Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Leo X sponsored Raphael, and countless cardinals filled their palaces with frescoes of gods and muses. But alongside piety, a fascination with sensual imagery took root. The rediscovery of antiquity meant not only Cicero and Virgil but also Ovid's Metamorphoses and the marble statues of Venus and Apollo. In papal Rome, sensuality was reborn under the guise of culture. Contemporaries commented on this shift with unease. One ambassador remarked that the Vatican looked less like the palace of the successor of Peter and more like the villa of a Roman emperor. Courtiers strolled through halls adorned with nude statues excavated from ancient ruins, while banquets were staged amid frescoes of Bacchus and his revelers. Was this art, or indulgence disguised as art? To many critics, the line was vanishing. Imagine yourself in one of those chambers, the ceiling arches high, painted with angels whose poses borrow suspiciously from pagan gods. Marble floors gleam, reflecting torchlight. A fountain bubbles in the corner, and around it stand statues of naked heroes, their polished forms glistening as though alive. Courtiers pause to admire them, some whispering about beauty, others about sin. You breathe in the scent of fresh plaster, incense and wine, and you realize that sacred and sensual have become inseparable. There are curious anecdotes about this era's papal spectacles. Pope Leo X, a Medici, loved theatrical performances, some of which included suggestive comedies and dances staged in Vatican courtyards. Accounts describe actors costumed as satyrs, chasing maidens in mock plays that blurred humour and lust. Guests roared with laughter, yet critics muttered that Rome had abandoned restraint entirely. The Holy Father's courtyard echoed not with hymns, but with the ribald laughter of carnival. Pamphlets circulated describing masquerades where cardinals donned elaborate costumes, some as classical gods, others as mythic creatures. The implication was clear. The guardians of chastity delighted in spectacles that celebrated the very sensuality they condemned in sermons. One biting satire claimed that the Vatican hosted its own Olympics of Venus, with prizes for the most daring performance. Was it literally true? Perhaps not. But the stories stuck, shaping the image of Rome as a city drunk on art, wine, and pleasure. Modern scholars wrestle with how to interpret this. Some argue that the blending of sacred and classical was an intellectual revolution, not intended as indulgence, but as a reclamation of human beauty. Others see it as evidence that Renaissance popes reveled too freely in pagan sensuality, embracing the body while neglecting the soul. The debate is unresolved, but the atmosphere it created is undeniable. Papal Rome was as much a stage for spectacle as for worship. Picture the sensory overload: lutes playing in the courtyard, torches smoking against marble walls, dancers moving among statues while the Pope himself reclines on a dais, nodding appreciatively. The scent of roses drifts from garlands hung overhead, mingling with the musk of sweat from the crowd. In this moment, the Vatican feels less like a church and more like a festival. You can almost hear the ghost of ancient Rome whispering through the laughter. And yet, not every eye saw corruption. Some artists and scholars believed this was a golden age, when the church embraced beauty as a reflection of divine creation. To them, the naked form was not scandalous but sacred, a testament to God's artistry. Others, however, saw the same frescoes and statues as proof that Rome had forgotten its vows, that the church had traded humility for spectacle. For ordinary believers, far from Rome, the rumours sufficed. They heard that the Pope's palace was filled with statues of naked gods, that plays of lust were performed in sacred courtyards, that money meant for the poor was spent on marble and masks. Whether the details were true mattered little. The impression was enough to erode faith. As you let the vision fade, the last image that lingers is of torchlight flickering on painted bodies, both holy and profane, their outlines shimmering as though caught between worlds. The Renaissance spectacle of vice was not simply indulgence, it was indulgence wrapped in beauty, cloaked in art, celebrated as culture even while it whispered of sin. And as you drift further, you realize that this mixture of grandeur and scandal left a mark as enduring as the frescoes themselves. The torchlight of Renaissance revelry dims, and suddenly the mood shifts. You hear not laughter but thunder rolling from a pulpit, from a gaunt figure who shakes with fury as he raises his voice against Rome. The air smells of smoke, but this time not from feasts or candles. It is the smoke of burning vanities. You are now in Florence, 1492, and the preacher is Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola's voice was unlike anything the papacy had heard in generations. This Dominican friar, sharp-eyed and uncompromising, denounced the luxury and vice of both Florence and Rome with apocalyptic force. He called the Vatican a harlot seated on the Tiber, drunk with lust and gold. His sermons were not soft rebukes. They were torrents of fire. People trembled as he declared that divine wrath would fall on Italy for its sins, and especially for the corruption of its popes. Savonarola's most famous act was the Bonfire of the Vanities in 1497. Citizens of Florence brought their mirrors, jewels, cosmetics, even fine dresses and immoral books, piling them high in the piazza to be set aflame. Flames roared upward, consuming the symbols of vanity. Among them, some whispered, were erotic paintings once hung in noble homes, images that might have found equal comfort in papal palaces. The irony burned along with the wood. Picture the scene: a chill February night, the smell of smoke so thick it stings your eyes, hymns rising from the crowd as flames lick the stars. Children march with palm branches, chanting psalms, while women throw perfume bottles onto the pyre. There is exhilaration in the air, a sense of purging, of cleansing, and yet beneath it lies fear, the fear of a world so corrupt it must be set on fire to be reborn. Savonarola's fury was not limited to Florence. His sermons directly attacked Pope Alexander VI, accusing him of living in sin and debauchery. The Borgias loathed him, and Alexander retaliated with excommunication. But Savonarola would not be silenced. "I fear not the Pope," he thundered, "for he may have the power of excommunication, but he has not the power to absolve himself of corruption." The clash between Savonarola and Rome became symbolic, the Pope representing the old order of indulgence, the friar representing the demand for reform. For a brief time, Florence itself seemed to sway toward the preacher's vision, as if the whole city had turned its back on worldly delights. Yet Savonarola's zeal also bred enemies at home. His purges, his unrelenting austerity, and his claim to prophetic visions alienated the powerful. The end came swiftly. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tortured, and condemned. On May 23rd, he was hanged and burned in Florence's Piazza della Signoria, the very place where he had staged his bonfires. His ashes were scattered in the Arno to prevent relics from being collected. Imagine the sound of crackling flames, this time not consuming perfumes or jewelry, but the body of the man who dared to denounce the Pope as the Antichrist. Was Savonarola a visionary reformer, or a fanatic undone by his own extremism? Historians disagree. Some see him as a martyr of conscience, others as a zealot who sought to impose his rigid morality through fear. What is certain is that his words pierced the image of the papacy. His charges of corruption, lust, and hypocrisy echoed across Europe, strengthening the growing chorus that Rome was beyond redemption. Think of the sensory contrast between Rome and Florence at that moment. In the Vatican, banquets continued, goblets raised, courtesans whispering, frescoes glowing under torchlight. In Florence, smoke of vanities curled into the sky, the crowd singing hymns as if to drown out temptation itself. The clash of images could not be more stark, one city celebrating indulgence, the other trying to burn it away. Even after his death, Savonarola's voice lingered. Luther would later praise him as a forerunner of the Reformation. Protestants held him up as proof that even within Catholicism, prophets had recognized the papal rot. For Catholics, his memory was more complicated, condemned in his day, yet admired by some later as a man who dared to cry out for purity. As you let the image fade, what remains is the sound of fire, a crackling reminder that Rome's indulgence provoked not only gossip and satire but fury so intense it sought to consume the very symbols of beauty and pleasure. Savonarola's sermons may have ended in smoke, but his warning hung in the air like ash, a warning that the papacy's sins could not be hidden forever. The smoke of Savonarola's bonfires fades, and now you find yourself in quieter chambers, spaces, not filled with sermons or flames, but with the scratching of pens on parchment, the murmur of conversation in Latin, Italian, and French. These are the gossip networks of the Renaissance, where news of papal indulgence travelled not only by rumour in taverns, but by carefully written reports from ambassadors, humanists, and courtiers. You are entering the world of letters and whispers, where scandal became a kind of currency. In Renaissance Europe, diplomacy was as much about observation as negotiation. Ambassadors stationed in Rome sent long, detailed missives to their masters. They described treaties, wars, and finances, yes, but they also relayed the texture of papal life. Who dined with whom, which courtesans were favoured, what banquets or spectacles had been staged. These reports often included sly references to the Pope's private affairs. Imagine a Venetian envoy dipping his quill into ink and noting, almost casually, the Holy Father's children are seen frequently in public, richly adorned. The sentence is simple, yet behind it lies an unspoken smirk. Florentine agents, too, kept careful watch. The Medici in particular were keenly interested in papal politics, and their correspondence reveals not only alliances but also sly commentary about papal mistresses. One letter mentions Julia Farnese, the lover of Alexander VI, with the wry nickname, the Bride of Christ. Such phrases spread quickly, and by the time they reached Florence, Venice, or Paris, they were repeated in salons with laughter and knowing nods. The humanists, those intellectuals of the Renaissance, also fueled this gossip. Men like Poggio Bracciolini and Lorenzo Valla wielded sharp pens, sometimes mocking the failings of the clergy in witty Latin dialogues. Their satire reached elite audiences, embedding the image of a lustful, worldly papacy into the cultural imagination. Imagine a small circle of scholars gathered around a manuscript, chuckling quietly at lines that compare cardinals to satyrs or describe the Pope's palace as a stage for Bacchic revels. The sensory detail here is different from feasts or orgies, it is subtler. Picture a candlelit study, the smell of ink and parchment heavy in the air, the quiet clink of a wine cup set down beside a half-written letter. Outside, Rome hums with noise, but inside, the ambassador bends low, writing words that will ripple across Europe. The pen becomes as dangerous as any dagger, carrying tales of indulgence far beyond the walls of the Vatican. One fascinating example is the correspondence of the Venetian ambassador during the reign of Alexander VI. His reports, now preserved, describe in frank terms the Pope's nepotism and the presence of his children. He notes the influence of Lucrezia Borgia, hinting at scandal without spelling it out. These careful insinuations ensured that Venice remained well informed and also ensured that papal reputations were tarnished abroad. And then there were the artists, who sometimes joined the gossip with their brushes. In Rome's frescoes and satirical sketches, you can glimpse caricatures of clerics with lecherous expressions or allegorical figures that hinted slyly at papal sins. These images circulated quietly, tucked into books or copied by hand, their humor sharpening the sting of criticism. Historians disagree on how seriously to take these networks of gossip. Some argue that they exaggerated reality, turning occasional lapses into systemic rot. Others insist that the consistency of these reports, written independently by diplomats from many states, suggests a core of truth. Either way, the perception mattered more than the reality. By the early 16th century, the idea of a lustful, decadent papacy was firmly lodged in the European imagination, thanks in no small part to these letters and rumors. Imagine being a merchant in Lyon or Antwerp, sitting at supper with friends when someone produces a letter from Rome. The words are read aloud. Tales of feasts, of papal daughters in jeweled gowns, of mistresses nicknamed with mocking piety. The listeners laugh. Some shake their heads in outrage. Others sigh with resignation. None of them have ever seen the Vatican, but through the web of gossip, they feel as though they have. What makes these networks so fascinating is their dual nature, part truth, part performance. Diplomats needed to impress their masters with lively detail. Humanists relished sharp wit, and reformers seized upon every whisper to fuel their cause. The Vatican became a stage not only for real scandals but for imagined ones, curated and circulated by the pens of those who had something to gain. And yet, gossip has power. It shapes belief, molds perception, and lingers in memory long after facts are forgotten. The Renaissance gossip networks ensured that even if papal feasts and mistresses had been exaggerated, the image of a corrupt papacy lived on. That image would later give reformers the ammunition they needed, for what people believed often mattered more than what was true. As you drift away from this scene, the sound that remains is not laughter but the scratch of quills, the faint rustle of parchment, and the whisper of words passed from one hand to another. These whispers travelled farther than armies, seeding doubt across Christendom. In their quiet way, they were as dangerous as fire. You drift onward, leaving behind the dimly lit studies of ambassadors and scholars, and step into a grand Florentine hall shimmering with light. Here, the smell of beeswax and burning torches mingles with the perfume of costly fabrics, and the scene is dominated by one family whose name still resonates through history, the Medici. When their bloodline intertwined with the papal throne, lust and strategy braided together in dazzling and often scandalous ways. The Medici rose from bankers to princes of Florence, and eventually into the heart of the papacy itself. Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513, while Giulio de' Medici ascended as Clement VII in 1523. These were not humble pastors, but men raised in a world of wealth, spectacle, and political cunning. Their family ties brought Florence and Rome into a union of immense cultural power, and with that union came the same shadowy indulgences of intimacy and nepotism that had plagued the papacy for centuries. Contemporary observers marveled at how openly the Medici popes celebrated family over faith. Leo X, for example, is remembered for his lavish banquets, hunts, and entertainments, all paid for with papal revenues. He was accused of filling the curia with relatives and Florentine allies, blurring the line between church and family business. His court became infamous not just for artistic splendor, but for indulgence in pleasures, both culinary and carnal. Picture a banquet under Leo X, tables groaning with roasted boar, Venetian glass goblets brimming with wine, musicians strumming while exotic dancers perform. The Pope reclines, surrounded not only by cardinals but by cousins and friends from Florence, their laughter rising above the music. Among them move women of striking beauty, some officially introduced as companions of noblemen, others quietly whispered about as favorites of powerful clerics. The atmosphere reeks of both grandeur and hypocrisy. A curious anecdote tells of Clement VII arranging the marriage of his illegitimate children and relatives with shameless openness. Chroniclers recorded that he bestowed dowries fit for queens, taken directly from the papal treasury. To some, this was practical politics marriages binding Rome to Florence, Florence to France, Florence to Spain. To others, it was nothing short of scandal. The holiest office in Christendom turned into a Medici family brokerage. Ambassadors again reported these details with a mixture of fascination and scorn. One Venetian envoy quipped that Rome had ceased to be the house of God and had become the house of Medici. Another noted the presence of young companions at papal banquets, whose beauty was praised too loudly to be ignored. Even if the letters exaggerated, the tone was clear. The Medici popes treated the Vatican more like a dynastic palace than a spiritual seat. Historians continue to wrestle with this. Some defend Leo X as a man of culture, a patron who brought the Renaissance to full bloom by supporting Raphael and Michelangelo. Others condemn him as a pope whose love of spectacle bankrupted the treasury, and whose household reflected indulgence rather than piety. Clement VII is remembered for political disasters like the sack of Rome in 1527, but whispers of his personal indulgences also haunted his reputation. Did he simply follow the pattern of his predecessors, or did the Medici legacy intensify the entanglement of lust and power? The answer remains tangled in contradiction. You can feel the sensory richness of those papal households. The scent of Florentine leather mingled with Roman incense, the gleam of marble halls decorated with Medici emblems, the sound of laughter and lute music spilling into courtyards. Courtesans, artists, and nobles mingled freely, their roles overlapping in ways that blurred propriety. One moment a woman was painted as a Madonna by an artist. The next, she was rumoured to be the mistress of a cardinal. The entire world of papal Rome seemed to spin in a dizzy carnival of art, politics, and desire. And yet beneath the splendour was fragility. When Rome was sacked by imperial troops under Clement VII's reign, the city's decadence was thrown into sharp relief. Soldiers stormed through palaces, dragging courtesans into the streets, plundering treasures meant for altars. The contrast was brutal. The papal court, once a symbol of power and indulgence, reduced overnight to chaos and humiliation. Ordinary Romans, who had long whispered about the Medici's corruption, saw divine judgment in the ruin. As you let the image fade, what lingers is the memory of family crests carved into marble, gleaming under torchlight, while behind them whispered scandals continued as before. The Medici connection brought glory and art, but it also tethered the papacy ever more tightly to the suspicion of lust and nepotism. For those who lived then, It was difficult to tell whether Rome was ruled by a pope or by a Florentine dynasty that simply wore papal robes. You step away from the great halls of Medici splendor and now find yourself in quieter, narrower passages of the Vatican itself. These are not the public chambers where frescoes glow and ambassadors bow, but hidden corridors that twist toward private rooms. Here, rumor has always lingered about secret chambers, places where indulgence and intimacy were hidden just beyond the reach of ceremony. To walk here in your imagination is to sense the thick hush of secrecy. Stories of clandestine papal rooms appear throughout chronicles and gossip. Some were simple apartments, lavishly furnished and kept away from curious eyes. Others were rumored to be decorated with imagery not meant for the faithful. Frescoes that leaned toward the erotic, statues drawn from pagan antiquity, paintings of sensual allegory. Rome was awash in rediscovered art from ancient ruins, and much of it depicted the human body in unabashed detail. Within certain papal chambers, so the whispers went, these images were displayed not as cultural trophies but as private indulgence. One persistent tale describes Pope Alexander VI's apartments, said to contain frescoes by Pinturicchio that blended Christian themes with pagan sensuality. Angels floated alongside muses, and the line between sacred and profane blurred on the walls themselves. Imagine stepping into such a room, incense curling in the air, the smell of polished wood and beeswax, and on the walls, figures both holy and earthly entwined in one continuous tableau. To a visiting courtier, it might have seemed cultured. To a reformer, it was proof that the Vatican had become a palace of sin. There are also whispers of hidden galleries where erotic manuscripts and sketches were kept. Renaissance artists, some commissioned by the papal court, sometimes produced playful or risque works alongside their sacred commissions. These secret images circulated quietly, tucked away in papal studies or gifted discreetly to companions. Picture the flick of torchlight on a parchment sketch of Venus or Apollo, hardly material for a sermon, yet cherished in the heart of the Vatican. Modern scholars still puzzle over these rumors. Were the secret rooms truly dens of indulgence, or simply studies and galleries decorated with the art of the Renaissance, later exaggerated by critics into scandal? Some argue that satirists invented the idea of hidden erotic chambers as propaganda to blacken the papal name. Others point to evidence that the papacy's own patronage of classical art meant sensual imagery was indeed present, though not always with the intent of scandal. The truth, like the frescoes themselves, is layered and difficult to peel back, yet the perception mattered. To ordinary believers, stories of secret rooms where popes surrounded themselves with erotic images sounded like blasphemy. The Vatican was supposed to be the heart of holiness, not a private gallery of sensual indulgence. Each rumor chipped away at the aura of sanctity, leaving behind unease and suspicion. Imagine the sensory richness of one of these rumored chambers. The air is warm, the curtains heavy with dust, muffling the outside world. You see golden oil lamps flickering, their flames catching on painted figures that look almost alive in the shifting light. Perhaps a courtesan reclines on cushions, her laughter hushed as she admires the paintings. Outside, pilgrims kneel in prayer, unaware that just a few walls away, the guardians of their faith are entertained by imagery far from holy. One anecdote, half legend and half satire, tells of cardinals touring a pope's private chambers and remarking that the decorations would make Venus herself blush. Whether they spoke in jest or judgment, the line reveals how easily the Vatican's treasures could be reinterpreted as scandal. What one man saw as art, another saw as sin. The idea of secret rooms endured long after the Renaissance. Centuries later, Protestants accused the Vatican of maintaining hidden collections of indecent art, and some even claimed that papal chambers contained treasures too scandalous to display. The persistence of these tales shows how powerfully the image resonated, even if the truth was more mundane. As you let the image fade, the last sensation is the closing of a heavy wooden door. Behind it lies a chamber you cannot fully see, filled with shadows, frescoes, and whispers. Whether these rooms were real or imagined, they symbolized a truth. The Vatican had come to embody not only spiritual authority but also secret indulgence, concealed behind walls too thick for the faithful to penetrate. You step out of those shadowy chambers and find yourself in the bustling streets of medieval and Renaissance Rome, where the air is thick with noise and barter. Here, the scandal is not confined to papal palaces or private apartments, it is woven into the very economy of the city. For Rome thrived on a peculiar trade, one regulated and even taxed by the papacy itself: prostitution. To walk through these streets is to smell roasted chestnuts from a vendor's brazier, hear the clop of donkey hooves on cobblestones, and catch glimpses of painted women leaning in doorways, calling out to passers-by. The presence of prostitutes in Rome was no secret. They gathered near bridges, piazzas, and even within sight of St. Peter's, their laughter echoing into the night. What makes this striking is not their existence. Sex work was common across Europe, but the fact that popes themselves profited from it. Papal officials collected levies from brothels, issuing licenses that legalized the trade. This meant that every whispered promise in a Roman alley jingled coins into the papal treasury. Take Pope Sixtus IV as an example. In the 15th century, he formally instituted a tax on brothels, justifying it as a way to regulate vice while filling the coffers of the church. The money was then used, at least in part, to fund the building of the Sistine Chapel. Imagine the irony. Pilgrims gazing upward at Michelangelo's painted ceiling, never realizing that some of its cost had been underwritten by Rome's sex trade. The contradiction is almost too rich to believe, and yet it is recorded in papal decrees and city registers. The sensory contrast is stark. By day, incense smoke rises in basilicas, choirs sing psalms, and pilgrims shuffle through holy relics. By night, lanterns glow in taverns where prostitutes mingle with soldiers and clerks, their perfume cloying in the warm Roman air. Some chroniclers describe entire streets filled with women dressed in bright gowns, their faces powdered, their laughter rising above the babble of languages from travelers. Rome was a holy city, but it was also a marketplace of desire. One anecdote, repeated with a mix of shock and amusement, tells of prostitutes fined for attending papal processions in dresses too ostentatious, their jewels rivaling those of noble women. The irony is cruel. The same women whose trade enriched the papal treasury were chastised for flaunting the wealth that system afforded them. It was as though the Vatican wanted both their money and their silence. Foreign visitors were both fascinated and appalled. German travelers, in particular, wrote of Rome as a city where sin strutted openly. One report lamented that the Eternal City seemed to host more courtesans than widows and virgins combined. To these outsiders, the sight of women plying their trade under the very shadow of St. Time Peter's was proof that the papacy's holiness was little more than a facade. Modern historians debate how extensive papal involvement really was. Some argue that the tax was primarily a pragmatic measure, a civic regulation in a bustling city, rather than a deliberate embrace of vice. Others see it as symptomatic of deeper hypocrisy, evidence that the Vatican chose revenue over morality. Both perspectives carry weight, but for contemporaries, perception was damning. The Pope, guardian of chastity, profited from lust. Picture a Roman night in those days. You walk past the Tiber, the water black beneath the moon, while a group of women cluster at the bridge, their voices calling softly. A soldier stops, coins jingle, and they disappear into a side street. Down the road, a papal officer notes the exchange, ready to collect the levy at month's end. The rhythm of sacred chants from a nearby church drifts faintly into the night, mingling with the laughter of courtesans. It is a chorus of contradiction, Rome's dual heartbeat of prayer and desire. One forgotten but telling episode comes from the Jubilee year of 1500. Pilgrims flooded into Rome seeking salvation, but chroniclers noted with cynicism that brothels flourished just as much as basilicas. Licensed by papal decree, they welcomed thousands of visitors, their profits swelling along with papal revenues. Imagine the absurdity. A pilgrim confessing sins in the morning, purchasing indulgences at noon, and slipping into a brothel by evening, all under the watch of the church. As you let the image fade, the sound that lingers is the mingling of hymns and laughter, bells and jingling coins. The prostitute tax reveals a deeper truth. Papal corruption was not only private but systemic, woven into the very fabric of Rome's economy. Holiness and vice were not opposites here, they were business partners. You step back into the rhythm of the city, but now the air is different. It is not the smoky closeness of a brothel street, nor the hush of secret chambers. It is carnival air, festive and wild, carrying the sound of drums, flutes, and laughter. Rome, like many cities of Europe, had its cycle of festivals, and within those days the papal court often took part. Imagine masks glittering in torchlight, jesters tumbling across squares, and the strange, unsettling sight of clerics joining in games that blurred the line between sacred dignity and worldly folly. The Roman carnival was one of the most notorious. Held before Lent, it was a season of license when rules were suspended and the streets swelled with revelry. Horses raced down the Via del Corso, floats paraded with mocking effigies, and the air filled with songs some pious, some bawdy. Popes themselves often sponsored these carnivals, seeing them as a way to both entertain the people and assert authority through spectacle. But the line between entertainment and scandal was thin, and too often the carnival became a showcase of excess. Accounts describe cardinals watching races from balconies while courtesans mingled among masked crowds, their laughter indistinguishable from the jokes of jesters. The Pope might appear briefly, blessing the festivities, yet everyone knew the carnival was less about faith and more about indulgence. Imagine the sensory overload: confetti of coloured paper, the smell of roasting meats sold at street stalls, music pounding, masks flashing. The Eternal City became, for a week, a playground. Some chroniclers tell of shocking games staged within the papal palaces themselves during carnival season. Guests competed in ribald contests, singing obscene verses, mocking rival cardinals, even staging performances that parodied sacred rituals. Whether every detail is true or exaggerated by critics, the impression is clear. In carnival season, restraint dissolved. Even the most solemn vestments could not fully resist the pull of masks and laughter. One anecdote, preserved in satirical verse, claims that Pope Paul II enjoyed dressing in elaborate costumes for carnival and watching the races from a balcony adorned with jewels. His critics mocked him as a man more interested in masquerade than in mass. Imagine the whispers rippling through Rome, the Holy Father as masquerader, blending into the carnival he was supposed to oversee. The atmosphere of these carnivals also highlighted the intertwining of sacred and profane. In some years, carnival floats carried effigies of biblical figures in comical poses, mocking both scripture and clergy. Crowds roared with laughter while preachers fumed that reverence had been sacrificed to entertainment. And yet, the papal court often looked the other way, sometimes even joining in. After all, carnival was a safety valve, a week of chaos before the austerity of Lent. Modern historians remain split about how deeply popes themselves indulged. Some argue that they merely tolerated carnival as a civic necessity, while others suggest that clerics, including popes, actively participated, blurring the boundaries intentionally. Whatever the degree, the symbolism was inescapable. The Vatican, seat of solemn authority, presided over Rome's most unholy laughter. Close your eyes and picture a carnival night. Torches flare along the street, the smell of sweat and wine thick in the air. Masked revelers jostle you, their costumes painted with obscene jokes. Music swells as a troupe of acrobats tumbles past, followed by a float carrying dancers dressed as gods and goddesses. You glance upward and see cardinals leaning from a balcony, their scarlet robes glowing in the torchlight, faces half hidden but clearly amused. The line between priest and participant has vanished. One curious tradition of Roman carnival involved the so-called games of mockery, where fools were crowned as kings and priests, lampooned with satirical songs. In some accounts, even papal servants joined these spectacles, their antics blurring reverence and ridicule. Was this harmless release, or was it evidence of a deeper corruption? Opinions differed then, as they do now. The lasting impact of Carnival was its erosion of boundaries. If the Pope could bless a festival that featured ribald songs and courtesans in masks, what did that say about the holiness of his office? Reformers seized on these contradictions, portraying Carnival as the true face of Rome, pious in name, indulgent in practice. As the music fades in your imagination, what remains is a curious unease. The laughter of Carnival lingers, but behind it you sense the erosion of authority, the way mockery chipped at the walls of sanctity. In Carnival season, the Vatican itself seemed to wink and nod, admitting that desire and folly were as much a part of Rome's soul as prayer and incense. The echo of Carnival laughter fades, but in its place you hear another kind of voice, quieter, sharper, slyer. It is the sound of poets, playwrights, and satirists who survived by wrapping their critiques of papal corruption in jokes, verses, and allegories. They could not shout openly like Savonarola without risking fire or rope, but they could whisper through rhyme. You are now in the world of satire, where survival depended on laughter that stung but never cut too deep. Rome and Florence alike produced a rich crop of lampoons during the later Middle Ages and Renaissance. Some circulated as handwritten verses, copied discreetly by clerks. Others were performed in taverns or marketplaces, their humour drawing crowds while slipping past censors. At their sharpest, these poems painted popes and cardinals as gluttons, drunkards, and lechers. One line from a Florentine satirist compared a pope's palace to a brothel where the rent is paid in indulgences. The rhyme earned chuckles but also nervous glances, for everyone knew such words could be dangerous. One curious piece, attributed to humanist poets of the 15th century, depicted the Pope as Jupiter surrounded by mistresses disguised as goddesses. Each goddess begged favours in exchange for embraces, while the cardinals stood by as satyrs playing pipes. The allegory was obvious to any educated reader, yet the veneer of classical myth gave the poet plausible deniability. Imagine hearing such verses recited at a small gathering, candlelight flickering, wine cups clinking, the listeners laughing softly while glancing toward the door to ensure no unfriendly ears were nearby. The sensory experience of satire was intimate. No public carnival roar here, but the quiet scratch of quills on parchment, the smell of ink and wax, the hushed murmur of voices leaning close. A single metaphor could carry enough sting to undermine papal dignity, yet its humour made it survivable. People chuckled, repeated the lines, and passed them along until the satire spread further than any sermon. One example that survives is the work of Pietro Aretino, who earned a reputation as the scourge of princes. Though active slightly later, his biting verses targeted papal Rome with audacious wit, accusing clerics of hypocrisy and lust. His reputation demonstrates how satire became both shield and weapon, shielding the writer from direct accusation by cloaking critique in humour and weaponizing laughter to erode reverence. Critics and reformers alike recognized the power of satire. Luther himself later noted how the reputation of Rome was shaped as much by biting jokes as by theological argument. If people believed the Pope was a lecher or a glutton, it was not always because of sermons or pamphlets, it was because of the rhymes sung in taverns or the jokes whispered in marketplaces. Modern scholars still disagree on how widespread these satires were. Some argue they circulated mostly among elites, humanists, diplomats, and clerics rather than the common faithful. Others suggest that the jokes filtered downward, simplified into folk songs and carnival chants that ordinary people could repeat. Regardless of reach, the impact was undeniable. Satire kept alive the image of papal corruption even when direct evidence was scarce. Picture one of these moments yourself. You are in a Roman tavern, the air thick with smoke from oil lamps, the smell of wine sharp in your nose. A minstrel strums a lute, and suddenly his song turns pointed, verses mocking a cardinal's mistress, a joke about indulgences funding courtesans' jewels. The crowd bursts into laughter, some clapping, some shaking their heads. For a moment, fear recedes, and the truth is spoken in jest. But when the song ends, silence falls because laughter can only protect you for so long. The paradox is haunting. The papacy, with its armies, its palaces, and its wealth, seemed invincible. yet its image could be undone by a few lines of verse. A rhyme repeated across Europe was harder to suppress than a rebellion, for it spread invisibly, from tongue to tongue, until even peasants in distant villages chuckled at Rome's expense. As you let this scene drift away, the sound that lingers is not the roar of carnival, but the softer, more dangerous ripple of laughter. Satire was survival, yes, but it was also subversion. It allowed critics to live another day, while slowly cutting away at the papacy's aura of sanctity. A jester's grin could be sharper than a sword, and in those grins you glimpse the slow unraveling of reverence. You leave behind the dim taverns where laughter hides sharp edges, and step into the solemn quiet of churches and monasteries, places where whispers carried different kinds of danger. For satire lived in shadows, but denunciations rang openly, often from pulpits or within monastic walls. And sometimes, those voices dared to point directly at Rome, accusing popes of sins so severe that even cloistered silence could not contain them. You now find yourself in the world of monks, preachers, and theologians who risked everything to speak about papal lust. Take John of Salisbury in the 12th century, a cleric who wrote carefully about the moral failures of leaders. His Polycraticus suggested that rulers, including churchmen who lived in vice, endangered not only themselves, but the entire order of society. While he did not name popes outright, the insinuation was strong enough that readers understood where his arrows were aimed. Imagine reading those lines in a cold stone monastery, the scent of damp walls and candle wax clinging to your robe, and feeling the thrill of recognition. The Pope himself was under scrutiny. Later, the Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola thundered against Rome from the pulpit of Florence, accusing Alexander VI of living like a pagan emperor rather than a shepherd of souls. His words drew thousands into piazzas, the crowd roaring approval as he condemned papal immorality. He described the Vatican as a den of harlots and tyrants, imagery so fierce that it resonated like fire. For years, his sermons kept Florence trembling with anticipation and Rome trembling with anger. A lesser-known but equally striking case comes from German monastic chronicles of the 15th century. In convent libraries, scribes copied reports of papal bastards and mistresses into marginal notes, preserving gossip alongside scripture. Picture an abbey scriptorium at night. A monk pauses, his quill hovering above parchment, before daring to write a line about the Pope's mistress. He knows it is risky, yet he records it anyway, a small act of resistance woven into the fabric of holy books. The sensory contrast is sharp. Inside monasteries, the smell is of vellum, ink, and damp straw. Outside, pilgrims still kiss relics and chant psalms. Yet in between these rituals, accusations grow. The words spoken by monks echo faintly through cloisters, bouncing off stone walls, feeding a growing unease. For ordinary believers, hearing such accusations from a man in a habit, sworn to chastity and obedience, carried weight that tavern songs could not match. Of course, the Church responded harshly. Savonarola's End on the Pyre is a reminder of how dangerous direct accusations could be. Many lesser voices were silenced by censure, imprisonment, or exile. Still, their words endured in manuscripts, in letters, and in memory. Some historians argue that these denunciations were exaggerated pious propaganda from zealots eager to paint the papacy in the worst possible light. Others maintain they revealed a truth Rome could no longer conceal. Lust and corruption were not accidents, but habits entrenched at the very top. You can imagine how shocking this must have been for ordinary faithful. To hear a monk suggest that the Pope lived more as a libertine than a shepherd was to shake the ground beneath their faith. Pilgrims who travelled to Rome hoping for blessings might instead encounter a city buzzing with rumour, monks whispering warnings, and preachers dropping hints of corruption. The gap between ideal and reality widened until trust itself began to fracture. One poignant anecdote survives from Northern Europe, where a Franciscan friar, after returning from Rome, preached that he had seen more sin in the Vatican than in any marketplace of brothels. His parishioners gasped, and some wept, for if Rome was corrupt, what did salvation mean? Whether his words were literal truth or bitter exaggeration mattered less than their effect. Doubt seeped into prayer like damp into stone. As you drift from this scene, you hear not laughter, but the echo of sermons, voices rising in cold stone chapels, accusing, lamenting, warning. The denunciations of monks and preachers carried no masks, no satire. They were blunt, sharp, and often fatal to those who spoke them. And yet, without them, the slow erosion of papal sanctity would not have reached the wider faithful. The monasteries became unlikely, crucibles of scandal, whispering truths that Rome desperately wished to silence. You step away from the echoing chapels where monks thunder their warnings and find yourself instead in the cramped chambers of scribes and printers, where ink-stained fingers shuffle parchment and type. This is the moment when private scandal begins to spread across Europe with unstoppable speed. The invention of the printing press gave wings to rumor, satire, and denunciation. What was once whispered in cloisters or sung in taverns now flew across borders, multiplied by presses in Basel, Nuremberg, and Venice. Imagine the sensory world of a print shop in the early 16th century. The heavy clack of the press, the squeak of the wooden screw, the smell of ink thick and metallic, the air damp with paper hung up to dry. Printers worked by candlelight, sweat on their brows, while apprentices darted about with fresh sheets. In these rooms, stories of papal mistresses and bastards were not only preserved, but amplified, reaching readers who had never set foot in Rome. One striking example is the spread of pamphlets describing the Borgia scandals. Stories of Alexander VI's supposed orgies, his illegitimate children, and his notorious mistress, Julia Farnese, were printed and reprinted, sometimes with lurid woodcuts. In these images, the Pope might be caricatured with devil horns, lounging amid women and wine, his keys of St. Peter twisted into symbols of lust. For many who read them, the boundary between fact and exaggeration blurred. The mere act of seeing such images gave the rumors weight. The printing press also carried voices of reformers like Martin Luther, who seized upon these stories as proof of Rome's corruption. His pamphlets thundered against indulgences, but alongside theological arguments, they carried the sting of scandal. Readers were told that the Pope who promised salvation was himself mired in sin, a man with mistresses, children, and greed. Imagine being a peasant in Saxony, holding a small printed sheet for the first time, reading that the Vicar of Christ lived like a pagan lord. The shock must have been visceral. A curious detail: some of the most biting prints were small enough to slip into a pocket, meant for quick distribution in markets or taverns. One woodcut shows a pope seated between two courtesans, his tiara tilted comically askew, while a priest collects coins in exchange for indulgences. It was crude, but effective. With each laugh or gasp, papal sanctity eroded a little further. Historians today debate how much of the lurid detail was true. Did Alexander VI truly host the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts? Or was it satirical exaggeration later blown out of proportion? Did papal children openly flaunt their lineage in the Vatican? Or were their lives more discreet than the pamphlets suggested? Scholars sift through evidence, weighing gossip against records. Yet the power of the printed word lies not in accuracy, but in reach. Once the rumor was inked, it lived forever. The effect was dramatic. Rome had once controlled its image through ceremony, fresco, and ritual, but now printers across Europe created an alternative portrait: the Pope as lecher, glutton, and tyrant. And unlike frescoes in the Vatican, these images could not be confined. They crossed mountains and seas, whispered in villages far from Italy. Picture yourself holding one of these pamphlets by firelight. The paper is rough beneath your fingers, the woodcut crude but unmistakable. A pope, corpulent and grinning, draped in women, coins spilling around his feet. The ink smudges as you turn the page, your hands trembling not from laughter but from the sense that something sacred has been mocked. You glance around to see if anyone has noticed what you are reading, then fold it quickly away. The image, however, stays burned into your mind. It is here, in these print shops, that the scandal of papal lust transcended rumor and became history. The printing press gave permanence to what might otherwise have been forgotten whispers. Even if exaggerated, the stories lived on, reproduced thousands of times, shaping how generations viewed the papacy. As you let the sound of the press fade, what lingers is the steady beat of the wooden screw turning, 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 each press stroke spreading scandal further across the map. The Vatican might have built walls of marble, but no wall could stop ink once it was set to paper. You leave behind the humming of print shops, the smell of ink and candle smoke still clinging to your imagination, and now step into the wide halls of courts and embassies. Here, scandal no longer lurks in taverns or pamphlets, it strides boldly across diplomacy. Because by the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, kings, emperors, and envoys were trading not only alliances and treaties with the papacy, but also rumors about its bedchambers. Imagine the Vatican as both a palace and a stage. Foreign ambassadors stood in gilded halls, watching the Pope process with jeweled tiara, while quietly exchanging gossip about his latest mistress. Reports sent back to Madrid, Paris, and Vienna sometimes mixed descriptions of papal decrees with sharp commentary on his private life. For rulers across Europe, the Pope's morality or lack of it became a diplomatic weapon. Consider the French crown, often at odds with Rome. Chroniclers in Paris gleefully circulated stories of papal illegitimate children, using them to argue that the Pope could not claim moral superiority over kings. Meanwhile, Spanish envoys, serving under Ferdinand and Isabella, sometimes complained in letters that papal negotiations were complicated by familial entanglements, a delicate phrase hinting that nephews and cousins, often papal bastards in disguise, distorted policy. You can picture these letters read aloud in candlelit courts, courtiers smirking at the thought that Rome was as entangled in scandal as any secular palace. One intriguing case is the diplomatic fallout surrounding Pope Alexander VI. His children by Vannozza dei Catanei, especially Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, were not only acknowledged but deployed as pawns in alliances. Cesare became a cardinal before abandoning the cloth for arms, while Lucrezia was married into noble families to cement ties. Ambassadors marveled at the brazenness of it all. To them, it looked less like the Vatican and more like another Italian dynasty, its policy dictated as much by bloodlines as by theology. The sensory impression of these embassies is rich. The rustle of silk cloaks, the scratching of quills on reports, the faint fragrance of imported spices in the air. Behind closed doors, ambassadors whispered of papal mistresses and nephews, while carefully noting which family had gained favor that week. Every rumor became ammunition proof that the Pope's authority was compromised, useful for kings who sought leverage in negotiations. One curious episode occurred when Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire received reports from envoys in Rome describing Alexander VI's extravagant banquets with courtesans present. Whether true or exaggerated, Maximilian seized on the gossip, spreading it to justify his own resistance to papal demands. The scandal became part of the chessboard of power, not only embarrassing Rome but weakening its political leverage. Modern historians debate whether these ambassadors exaggerated deliberately. Some argue their reports were colored by their masters' agendas, painting the Pope in the worst possible light to strengthen bargaining positions. Others insist that enough independent accounts survive to confirm that scandal truly did shape diplomacy. Either way, the effect was undeniable. The Pope's reputation was not only a matter of faith but also of politics. Picture a banquet in a royal court. The firelight gleams on silver dishes, courtiers laugh, and at the far end of the hall, a visiting envoy rises to share his news from Rome. He speaks of papal decrees, of alliances, but then lowers his voice conspiratorially. And they say the Holy Father spends more nights with his mistress than with his prayers. The hall erupts in laughter, and the Pope's moral authority, miles away in the Vatican, shrinks a little more. The irony is sharp. The papacy, which claimed to sit above kings as the moral guide of Christendom, found itself undone by the same gossip that plagued every court in Europe. A single rumor about a mistress or a bastard could undercut negotiations, sow mistrust, and embolden rulers to push back against papal demands. Authority leaked away not through armies, but through laughter and whispers. As you let the image fade, the lingering sound is not of hymns or chants, but the murmur of courtiers trading secrets over wine. The scandal of papal lust had escaped its cloisters and pamphlets, and now it danced freely in royal halls, shaping politics as much as sermons. The Pope was no longer only a spiritual father, he was a character in Europe's gossip, and gossip proved a sharper tool than steel. You step into the waning glow of the Renaissance, where the corridors of the Vatican seem quieter, but the echoes of centuries of scandal still cling to the marble. The smell of incense lingers, yet it mixes with the memory of perfumes once carried through papal apartments. This final space you enter is less about flesh and more about legacy, the enduring shadow left by centuries of whispered rumors, printed pamphlets, carnival laughter, and diplomatic barbs. The late 16th century brought new forces to bear: the Counter, Reformation, the Council of Trent, and a renewed emphasis on clerical discipline. Yet even as the papacy strove to polish its image, the memory of earlier corruption remained lodged in the minds of Europe. For reformers, it was proof that Rome could not be trusted. For satirists, it was an endless well of material, and for the faithful, it was a wound that healed slowly, if at all. One clear example of this lingering distrust is the persistence of anti-papal tracts in Protestant lands. Pamphlets from Geneva, Wittenberg, and London recycled the same tales of mistresses and bastard nephews, ensuring that even generations after Alexander VI and his Borgia clan, the image of the Pope as lecher remained vivid. These stories became less about specific individuals and more about a collective myth, the papacy as inherently corrupt, its throne cushioned not by prayer but by indulgence and lust. At the same time, Rome attempted to respond. New rules for cardinals stressed sobriety, chastity, and dignity. Seminaries were founded to enforce clerical training, but reform often felt like a belated patch, as though the Vatican was scrubbing stains from silk long after the banquet had ended. The frescoes of Michelangelo still gleamed overhead, but those who gazed at them knew that their funding had come in part from brothels, indulgences, and taxes on desire. A striking detail from the Council of Trent shows how deep the damage ran. Bishops debated whether priests should be forced into stricter isolation from households, since familiarity with women was deemed a source of scandal. Though the decree focused on local clergy, everyone knew the memory of papal mistresses haunted the conversation. It was as if the entire church was trying to build walls against its own past. Scholars remain divided on how much these scandals truly shaped the Reformation. Some argue they were peripheral, colourful distractions beside deeper theological disputes. Others insist that without the image of a corrupt Rome, Luther's hammer might never have echoed so loudly on the Wittenberg door. In either case, the perception of papal vice became part of history's bloodstream, impossible to filter out. Picture one last sensory scene. You walk through St. Peter's Square. As twilight deepens, pilgrims kneeling, incense drifting from the basilica. The cobblestones are cool beneath your feet, yet as you glance toward the looming dome, you remember the stories whispered in taverns, sung at carnivals, scrawled in pamphlets, and traded in courts. The marble seems whiter, the ceremonies more austere, but beneath them lies an undercurrent of memory, centuries of scandal that no decree could fully erase. It is here that your journey pauses. You've walked through chambers of intimacy, corridors of power, alleys of brothels, stages of carnival, and print shops alive with ink. Each place revealed a different facet of papal scandal, sometimes true, sometimes exaggerated, but always potent. Together, they form not just gossip, but an enduring narrative, one that reshaped how Europe saw its spiritual father. And now, as the night deepens, it is time for you to rest. The sound of Rome's streets grows quieter in your imagination, the torches flicker and dim, and even the laughter of courtesans and the rhythm of printing presses fade into a softer hum. The scandals, The whispers, the lampoons all begin to dissolve like smoke drifting into a night sky. What lingers is not the sharpness of accusation but the calm awareness that history is always layered, never tidy. You picture St. Peter's Dome beneath the stars, its shadow stretching across the city. Beneath that shadow lived men who were fallible, men whose choices shocked, amused, or horrified the world. And yet, the Church endured. You let that paradox settle, neither excusing nor condemning, simply acknowledging the weight of centuries pressing gently against your thoughts. Your breath slows as you imagine the silence of a cloister at midnight, the cool scent of stone, the soft rustle of robes. In that silence, all the noise of scandal and satire grows distant. What remains is the quiet rhythm of time, the reminder that even the loudest rumors eventually fade into history's pages. Let yourself sink into that calm. The streets are empty now, the brothels shuttered, the palaces locked, the presses stilled. Rome itself seems to sleep. You too can close your eyes, knowing that the story has run its course, its jagged edges worn smooth by the telling. The past cannot be changed, but tonight it can be set gently aside. So breathe deeply, let the images soften into shadows, and as the last echoes of scandal fade, you are left only with the peace of quiet night. Sweet dreams.